In the deep chill of September 1533, under the carved beams of Greenwich Palace, a child was born who would one day hold in her hands the fate of an island kingdom. The air outside smelled of the Thames, briny and metallic, its mist rolling over London like a soft grey curtain. Inside the palace, however, the air was charged with a tension that no candlelight could ease. For all the polished marble and silks, for all the heralds proclaiming a royal birth, something was amiss. King Henry VIII had expected a son. What he received was a daughter, Elizabeth, child of his second wife, Anne Boleyn. The rejoicing was measured, polite but uneasy, for beneath the hymns of celebration there hummed the quiet discontent of a court that understood how fragile the crown's favour could be. Elizabeth's first breath came into a world that had already whispered her name with suspicion. Her mother's marriage had torn England away from the Roman Church, had made the king head of his own faith, and had reshaped the kingdom's very soul. The infant's arrival was a living reminder of that schism. Henry had divorced Queen Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne, breaking with the Pope, defying Europe's oldest power. All that storm of politics and passion had been waged for a son, a boy, to carry the Tudor line forward. But when the midwives presented a tiny red-haired girl wrapped in crimson cloth, the king's smile faltered for the briefest heartbeat. A daughter, yes, healthy, strong lungs, yet no heir. The court's joy curdled into discomfort. Still, the official proclamations called her Princess Elizabeth, heir to the throne of England. Musicians played, bells rang, and the heralds shouted their rehearsed congratulations. But behind jewelled doors, courtiers murmured about omens. Some recalled how the astrologers had predicted a prince. Others whispered that Anne Boleyn's ambition had cursed her. Elizabeth's birth was not a triumph, it was a test. Anne, radiant and restless, would not be cowed by disappointment. She poured her pride into the child, surrounding the infant's cradle with silks and scholars, declaring that Elizabeth would be as learned and noble as any prince. "My daughter," she said often, "shall outshine them all." But already the ground beneath them trembled. Henry's passion cooled, his eyes turned elsewhere. The glittering promise of Anne Boleyn was fading into irritation, and the same court that had once hailed her as queen now studied her for flaws. Elizabeth's earliest memories would not be of her parents' affection, but of absence and removal. When she was scarcely 3 years old, her world was shattered. The corridors of Greenwich grew hushed. Servants whispered and avoided her gaze. Her mother, once the dazzling heart of the court, was imprisoned in the Tower of London accused of adultery, witchcraft, and treason. None of it made sense to the child. One day her mother's voice, lilting and firm, filled her nursery. The next, silence. On the 19th of May 1536, the silence was broken only by the thud of an axe. Anne Boleyn, elegant even in death, met her end beneath the shadow of the tower. The witnesses said she died with grace, whispering prayers for her daughter. Far away, little Elizabeth played unaware, though the absence carved itself into her bones. The crown she might have inherited fell from her mother's head and vanished into blood and history. In the weeks that followed, her father erased Anne's name. Her portraits were destroyed, her initials chipped away from stonework, her memory scrubbed from the palaces she once graced. Elizabeth herself was declared illegitimate. She was no longer princess, but Lady Elizabeth. Her rank, her inheritance, her future all gone with the stroke of her father's quill. Yet even as the world turned cold around her, she endured. In her small household at Hatfield or Hunsdon, Elizabeth grew into a solemn, thoughtful child. Those who saw her remarked upon her intelligence and poise, traits remarkable in one so young. She absorbed language quickly, Latin, French, Italian, guided by her tutors, who treated her not as a discarded child but as a prodigy. The scholar Roger Ascham would later call her mind a bright mirror of learning. Even as the royal court forgot her, she cultivated something rare, independence. Her father's moods shifted like weather, and Elizabeth learned early that love from a king could be conditional. When his third wife, Jane Seymour, bore him the long-awaited son, Edward Elizabeth, watched from the margins as England rejoiced. She sent gifts to her baby brother, wrote him letters as soon as she could write at all, and in doing so showed the grace and self-control that would later define her reign. Though she had every reason for jealousy, she instead learned to bide her time. The palace that had once been her home was now a distant dream. Yet Elizabeth's household, modest compared to the royal court, was alive with ideas. Humanist tutors read to her from Plato and Cicero. She practiced music, dancing, and rhetoric. Every lesson was a form of armor, each book a weapon in a world that doubted her worth. She observed the fragile fates of women around her, her mother dead, her stepmothers either dying or discarded, and she began to see the crown not as a birthright, but as a peril. At night, the flicker of candlelight danced across the tapestries as she listened to the wind scratching the shutters. Sometimes she would whisper to the silence, asking questions only she could hear. Why had her mother died? Why was her own life spared? What did it mean to be a Tudor without a mother's name, without a father's favour? History would later paint her as fearless, but in those early years, she was a survivor, an orphan, learning to live in the echo of power. Henry's next wives passed through Elizabeth's life like shadows. Anne of Cleves, quiet and kind, treated her with gentleness. Catherine Howard, barely older than Elizabeth, became both sister and cautionary tale, beheaded for infidelity in 1542. And then came Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, who would prove the most important of all. Catherine saw promise in the neglected child and brought her back into favour. Under her guidance, Elizabeth's education deepened and her faith matured. The Queen's household became a small academy of learning, where scholars debated theology and history at the dinner table. It was Catherine Parr who helped reconcile Elizabeth with her father, paving the way for the girl's cautious return to the royal family. For the first time in years, Elizabeth appeared at court beside her younger brother Edward and older sister Mary. The three Tudor children, each born of different mothers, posed together for portraits, symbols of unity that disguised deep divisions. Henry's health was failing, and with it, the stability of the realm. The old king's eyes softened when he looked at Elizabeth. Perhaps she reminded him of Anne, sharp, quick, and proud. Or perhaps he simply saw the strength that his kingdom would one day need. When Henry died in 1547, the court's pageantry masked a nation trembling on the edge of change. The boy king, Edward VI, only 9 years old, was crowned amid prayers and apprehension. Elizabeth, now 14, wept not just for her father, but for the uncertain road ahead. She had lost the only constant presence in her life, however fickle that love had been. The crown had moved on, but her survival instinct sharpened. She knew how swiftly fortunes turned in Tudor England. Elizabeth's adolescence was marked by both privilege and peril. She returned to live with Catherine Parr, now remarried to Thomas Seymour, the ambitious brother of the late Queen Jane. The household, for a brief time, felt almost like family, until Thomas's dangerous flirtations shattered that illusion. He was charming, reckless, and far too bold with the young princess. He would enter her chamber early in the morning, teasing, laughing, cutting her gown in jest. To some, these were the actions of a man testing boundaries. To Elizabeth, they were lessons in vigilance. When Catherine discovered the impropriety, her fury was swift. Elizabeth was sent away, her reputation once again precarious. Soon after, Catherine died in childbirth, and Thomas's ambitions grew darker. He plotted for influence over the young king, even imagining marriage to Elizabeth. But his schemes collapsed, and he was arrested and executed for treason. Elizabeth, questioned by the council, faced them with unshakable composure. "I am not so simple," she declared, "as not to see mine own peril." By 17, she had learned more of human frailty and power than most rulers twice her age. Each betrayal taught her restraint, each loss strengthened her resolve. The world saw a pale, red-haired girl with a measured smile, but within her burned a fierce intellect and a quiet determination. She had watched her mother rise and fall, her father marry and destroy, her guardians fail and die. To survive in Tudor England was an art, and Elizabeth was mastering it. Even as storms gathered over the kingdom, religious upheaval, economic strain, noble rivalries, she withdrew into study. Books became her sanctuary. She read the Bible in Greek, Seneca in Latin, the French poets for pleasure, and the Italian philosophers for strategy. In her letters, her writing already carried the clarity of a ruler, "I do not seek to be loved," she wrote to a friend, "but to be known." There was a precocious wisdom in her solitude. When she walked through the gardens of Hatfield, the late autumn sun filtering through the branches, she would pause to watch the leaves fall, each one bright for a moment, before surrendering to the earth. Perhaps she thought of her mother's fall, or her father's glory turned to decay. Perhaps she simply understood that power, like beauty, was fleeting. To endure, one must learn when to bend and when to stand firm. The people who tended her household saw both the vulnerability and the steel beneath her calm. Her governess, Cat Ashley, adored her and feared for her in equal measure. "She hath a man's wisdom and a woman's heart," Cat once said. It was true. Elizabeth could charm with a glance, disarm with wit, and vanish behind silence when danger loomed. As the years passed, the child of scandal became a young woman of substance. Her illegitimacy, once a curse, had granted her freedom from expectation. She could observe without acting, learn without exposure. In that quiet space, she was shaping the qualities that would define her reign: prudence, empathy, intellect, and the subtle power of delay. When she turned 20, the kingdom itself seemed to mirror her transformation. The old certainties of Henry's rule were gone. The Reformation had torn at England's soul, and faith had become a weapon. Elizabeth watched as her half-brother Edward's council enforced Protestant reforms that left churches bare and citizens restless. She, ever cautious, kept her beliefs private, reading the scriptures but revealing little of her own conviction. By then, courtiers had begun to take notice of her again. Ambassadors described her as striking, with bright eyes and a sharp tongue. They saw not the discarded child but a potential queen. In their letters, they speculated on her future. Could she marry a prince of Europe? Could she serve as a pawn in foreign alliances? None yet imagined she would one day rule them all. But history was already leaning toward her. The tides of fate that had once washed her family away were turning back. The child of a fallen queen, the girl declared unfit for a crown, was quietly preparing for a destiny greater than any could see. Her tutors saw it in her diligence, her household in her discipline, her people, though they did not yet know her, in the quiet stories that travelled from estate to estate about the learned young lady at Hatfield. She had survived betrayal, scandal, and abandonment. She had endured exile within her own country, and through it all, she had cultivated a strength that was neither loud nor boastful but unbreakable. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw the child of Anne Boleyn's tragedy. She saw herself Elizabeth, a woman forged in loss, destined to rule by endurance, not entitlement. The story of her childhood was one of survival in the shadow of power. But survival, for Elizabeth, was not enough. Even then, even in those quiet years before history turned its gaze fully upon her, she was learning how to command the very thing that had nearly destroyed her, the crown. The night skies over Hatfield were endless and soft, filled with the whisper of wind across the fields. Somewhere beyond them, the kingdom dreamed of stability, of a peace it had not known for decades. Elizabeth, standing by her window, felt the pulse of that dream. She did not yet know how it would come to her, only that she must be ready when it did, for the blood that had doomed her mother now called her to something far greater. And so, in the silence after the storm of her childhood, the child of a fallen queen began to rise. The orphan princess, in the uneasy years that followed her father's death, Elizabeth learned that the absence of a crown could be as dangerous as the weight of one. The Tudor line, though gilded in glory, was fraying beneath its own contradictions. Her half-brother, Edward VI, now sat upon the throne, his pale young face framed by solemn clerics and ambitious lords who ruled in his name. The court that had once revolved around the magnetic will of Henry VIII was now a battlefield of ministers, each vying for control of the fragile new king. Elizabeth, at 14, was no longer the forgotten child of scandal, but the quiet, watchful sister of England's ruler. She occupied a strange space, too royal to be dismissed, yet too suspect to be trusted. The same courtiers who once looked past her now watched her every movement for signs of ambition. They saw in her the intellect of her mother, the temper of her father, and the composure of a born survivor. That combination frightened them. At Hatfield House, Her days were filled with study and scrutiny. Books, letters, and silent observation became her refuge. She understood, even then, that words could save her life where armies could not. The Protestant faith now defined her brother's reign, and the old Catholic traditions that had shaped her sister Mary's world were being stripped from the churches. Candles and icons were torn down. Latin masses replaced by plain English prayers. Elizabeth kept her opinions buried deep beneath her calm demeanour. She had seen how faith could destroy those who spoke too freely. Her education was her escape and her fortress. Guided by the brilliant tutor Roger Ascham, she mastered Greek, Latin, and Italian until she could move between them with ease. Her letters read like the writings of a philosopher, precise, eloquent, deliberate. She studied logic and theology, learned the histories of Rome and Greece, and absorbed their lessons on power and virtue. In these ancient examples, she saw reflections of her own precarious age. Republics turned to empires, rulers undone by their passions, and nations reborn from ruin. Ascham once wrote that Elizabeth possessed both the diligence of a student and the grace of a queen. But diligence alone could not protect her. The politics of the court seeped even into her quiet study. The Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, governed in the young king's stead, yet his enemies plotted ceaselessly. Among them was his own brother, Thomas Seymour, whose reckless charm had already brought Elizabeth peril. The scandal of his advances lingered, whispered in corridors long after his execution. Elizabeth's composure during that ordeal had impressed even her critics. She had been questioned under oath, her reputation dissected by men twice her age, and she had never faltered. "I thank God," she had written afterward, "that I am not a fool to desire to meddle in such dangerous matters." Those words would come to define her. She had seen how quickly favour turned to ruin, how women at court were used and discarded. To survive, she learned to listen more than she spoke, to act only when action could not be avoided. Her letters to her brother were warm but careful, filled with expressions of loyalty yet never flattery. To Edward, she presented herself as the obedient sister, to his ministers as harmless and studious. In truth, she was studying them all. When Edward's health began to wane, the atmosphere of the court darkened. The boy king, frail and earnest, was moulded by his advisers into a Protestant symbol, a living banner for reform. The question of succession loomed like a gathering storm. Neither of his half-sisters fit easily into the plans of those in power. Mary was a devout Catholic, tied to Rome and Spain. Elizabeth, though inclined toward the new faith, was unpredictable, too intelligent to be moulded. The council feared both women in different ways. In 1553, when Edward's cough turned to blood, England held its breath. Behind closed doors, plots unfolded. The Duke of Northumberland, seeking to keep power, persuaded the dying boy to alter the line of succession, naming his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as heir instead of his sisters. Elizabeth knew the danger this meant. She wrote little, said less, and waited. When Edward died that July, the nation trembled between rival queens. Lady Jane's reign lasted only 9 days. The people, weary of manipulation, rallied to Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth, outwardly dutiful, sent her sister messages of loyalty. She knew that any sign of hesitation could be fatal. When Mary rode triumphantly into London, Elizabeth followed behind her, bright-haired, serene, and silent, her every step calculated. The crowd cheered both sisters, seeing in them a fragile hope of unity. But beneath the smiles, suspicion was already at work. Mary, child of the humiliated Catherine, bore deep scars of her father's cruelty and her mother's downfall. To her, Elizabeth was the living reminder of Anne Boleyn, the woman who had shattered her childhood. Their bond, born of blood, was poisoned by memory. Mary sought comfort in restoring the Catholic faith, in undoing what her father and brother had done. Elizabeth, cautious as ever, attended Mass when summoned, knelt when required, and gave no hint of dissent. Yet the council and the priests around Mary distrusted her. They saw her popularity, her education, her composure, and feared that she might one day take the crown herself. In the cold winter of 1554, rebellion ignited. Sir Thomas Wyatt, a nobleman disillusioned by Mary's plan to marry King Philip of Spain, raised his banner against the Queen. He claimed loyalty to England but protested the Spanish alliance that threatened to make the country a vassal of a foreign power. When the rebellion failed, suspicion turned instantly toward Elizabeth. The logic was cruel but familiar. If there was unrest, surely the ambitious sister was behind it. One morning, royal guards arrived at her door. Elizabeth was ill with fever, yet there was no mercy. She was ordered to appear before the council. Wrapped in a cloak, pale and trembling, she was brought through the streets of London, where the people watched in silence. They remembered her mother's walk to the Tower. They knew how this might end. At the Tower gates, Elizabeth hesitated. "Here I come," she murmured to herself, "where my mother came before me." The heavy doors closed behind her with a groan that seemed to echo through her very soul. For 2 months, she lived in the shadow of death, uncertain each dawn whether it would be her last. The tower's cold walls held ghosts enough to haunt a lifetime. From her narrow window, she could see the chapel where her mother lay, buried beneath the stones. Interrogations followed, relentless and cruel. The council demanded names, confessions, letters, proof of guilt. Elizabeth, exhausted but resolute, denied all knowledge of the rebellion. Her words were calm, her handwriting steady. "I am innocent of this man's doing," she wrote, "and to my knowledge never conspired against the Queen." Even in captivity, she understood that composure was power. Mary hesitated to sign her sister's death warrant. Perhaps she remembered their shared blood, or perhaps she feared public outrage. Elizabeth's imprisonment dragged on until, by careful diplomacy and the intervention of allies, she was released, though not into freedom. She was sent to Woodstock under guard, confined to a crumbling manor watched by soldiers. There, surrounded by isolation and damp English rain, she waited again. Those months at Woodstock hardened her spirit. She passed the days reading, writing, walking the grounds when permitted. When she was denied ink and paper, she wrote with charcoal on the walls. "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be," she scrawled. "Queen Elizabeth shall be." It was not defiance but faith, a whispered promise to herself. The wind through the corridors carried the scent of damp earth and moss, the slow decay of neglect. Yet within that decay she found endurance. Mary's reign grew darker as the years passed. Her marriage to Philip brought not peace but resentment. Her attempts to restore Catholicism led to persecution, the burnings of Protestants that would earn her the name Bloody Mary. England, weary of fire and fear, began to look elsewhere for hope. That hope, whispered in taverns and market squares, wore the face of Elizabeth. When Mary's health began to fail in 1558, Elizabeth was summoned from her confinement. The kingdom teetered on the edge of exhaustion, its treasury drained, its people divided. The Queen, aging and childless, had no choice but to acknowledge her sister as heir. It was a reluctant mercy, born less of affection than necessity. Elizabeth rode to court with measured dignity, her eyes steady, her silence eloquent. She knelt before her sister, who looked upon her with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. There were no tears between them, no words of reconciliation. Too much history lay between their hearts. Yet in that moment, the weight of destiny shifted. When Mary died on a cold November morning, the bells that tolled across England were both mournful and expectant. The people, starved for stability, turned their eyes to Hatfield, where Elizabeth waited. She was 25 years old when the messenger arrived, breathless and mud-spattered, to deliver the words that would change her life. The Queen is dead. Elizabeth fell to her knees beneath an old oak tree and murmured in Latin, "Ad domino factum est istud et est mirabile in oculis nostris." This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes. The moment was quiet, almost private, yet it marked the beginning of an age. From that oak's shadow, she rose not as the orphaned daughter of a disgraced queen, but as the sovereign of England. Around her, the world trembled between old faiths and new, between ruin and rebirth. The kingdom that had once turned its back on her now awaited her command. Her childhood of silence had taught her patience. Her years of danger had taught her strength. The girl who had survived scandal, imprisonment, and exile now stood poised to rule a fractured nation. Her face, pale and composed, betrayed little emotion, but within her a quiet fire burned, a will shaped by every loss she had endured. The orphan princess was no longer a child of uncertainty. She had walked through fear, endured betrayal, and emerged unbroken. The crown that once seemed so distant now glimmered before her, not as a gift, but as a burden she had earned through survival. And so, as the winter sun broke through the clouds above Hatfield, Elizabeth Tudor became Queen of England. The bells rang not for the daughter of Henry or the shadow of Anne Boleyn, but for the woman who would transform grief into glory and weakness into majesty. Lessons in caution. Elizabeth's coronation morning began beneath a pale January sky, the kind of English dawn that felt as though it had been washed in silver. The air carried the smell of frost and wood smoke, and as she stepped from the Tower of London to begin her procession through the capital, the crowd erupted not merely in loyalty, but in relief. England, after years of fire and fear, wanted to believe again. It was 1559. The bells clanged in Westminster, echoing against the narrow lanes, and the new queen, robed in white satin and cloth of gold, rode through the city gates. Her hair, flame-bright and loose upon her shoulders, shimmered beneath the winter light. In her face, the people saw not only youth but endurance, the living promise that the storms of Tudor rule might finally break into calm. Yet beneath the pageantry, Elizabeth understood that she was stepping onto a knife's edge. The crown glittered, but it was made of thorns. Her kingdom was divided between Catholics and Protestants, between old loyalties and new ambitions, between those who believed a woman should rule and those who did not. Every cheer that greeted her masked another calculation. Every smile in her court concealed a question. How long could this queen last? She had learned caution from her childhood, and now she wore it like armour. The lessons of survival, of silence and watchfulness were the foundation of her rule. She had seen her mother die for ambition, her stepmother Catherine Howard perish for recklessness, her sister Mary burn for conviction. Elizabeth's gift was not to avoid danger but to read it, to sense its approach long before others saw the signs. On the morning of her coronation, she entered Westminster Abbey with that awareness thrumming beneath her calm. The music rose like incense, filling the vaulted space, while nobles and clergy knelt in ranks of colour and gold. The Archbishop of Canterbury, now chosen from the Protestant clergy, anointed her with holy oil, sealing her as God's servant on earth. Yet even as she knelt before the altar, her mind was already on the balance she must strike, to rule without alienating, to reform without provoking war. The young queen had inherited not only a throne but a wound. Mary's reign had scorched the land, more than 200 Protestants had burned at the stake. Spain had drained England's treasury, and famine shadowed the countryside. Across the Channel, France and Spain, both Catholic powers, watched her ascent with wary eyes, seeing in her a heretic crowned. Within her own court, many nobles doubted that a woman alone could command a nation. But Elizabeth knew her own strength. She had survived the Tower. She could survive men's expectations. Her council, composed of cautious veterans and ambitious reformers, gathered around her in those first months. Chief among them was William Cecil, her Secretary of State, whose steady intellect matched her own. Cecil would become the architect of her government, the mirror of her prudence. Together they would craft a policy of survival disguised as moderation. "Do not make windows into men's souls," she told him once, meaning that religion should not destroy unity. The phrase would become her creed. At her coronation feast, while trumpets blared and dancers twirled, she smiled and raised her cup, but her eyes missed nothing. She knew who applauded out of loyalty and who out of fear. She saw, too, the faces of foreign ambassadors, envoys from Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, calculating what sort of queen this Elizabeth might be. They sent dispatches home describing her grace, her intelligence, and her unsettling independence. One wrote that she speaks little, but when she does, it is with such reason that none dare contradict her. The pageantry lasted days, but when the final torches burned low, she was left with the burden of her crown and the hum of a restless nation. Her first act was to restore stability through measured reform. The Elizabethan settlement of 1559, forged with Cecil's counsel, sought to end the decades of religious chaos. The Act of Supremacy reaffirmed the monarch's role as head of the Church of England, while the Act of Uniformity reintroduced the Book of Common Prayer. Yet Elizabeth walked carefully between extremes. She allowed certain Catholic symbols to remain. She forbade radical Protestant iconoclasm. It was not perfection she sought, but peace. Still, her caution bred enemies. Rome denounced her. Spain's King Philip, once her brother-in-law, saw her as both a heretic and an opportunity. Suitors began to circle, each promising alliance and legitimacy. Philip himself, Archduke Charles of Austria, and later the French Duke of Anjou. But Elizabeth, remembering how marriage had chained her sister and doomed her mother, turned these proposals into diplomacy. She dangled possibility without promise, weaving affection into strategy. At court, her charm became legendary. She spoke to her nobles as though each were her favourite, yet none could claim her heart. She danced, laughed, and debated with equal skill, transforming her presence into a form of power. The courtiers who served her learned that affection could be both genuine and political. To win her favour was to rise, to lose it was to vanish. Among those closest to her was Robert Dudley, a man whose history was entangled with hers since youth. Handsome, ambitious, and devoted, Dudley captured the Queen's affection in ways few others dared. His wife's sudden death under suspicious circumstances fueled gossip across Europe that Elizabeth might wed him, or worse, that she had conspired to be rid of his wife. The scandal rocked the court, but Elizabeth did what she had always done. She endured by silence. She neither confirmed nor denied her feelings, allowing mystery to become her shield. The virgin queen persona that would later define her was not born of purity but of politics. In a world ruled by men, she understood that marriage would mean surrendering power. A husband, especially a foreign one, would rule in her name and diminish her authority. By declaring herself wed to her kingdom, she became untouchable. The poets of her court, Spenser, Sidney, and later Shakespeare, would turn this image into myth, but its foundation was cold realism. Beyond her court, the world burned. In France, Catholics and Huguenots slaughtered each other in waves of civil war. In Scotland, her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, returned from France to claim her throne, a Catholic queen ruling a Protestant land. Elizabeth watched her carefully, aware that Mary, as a legitimate granddaughter of Henry VII, held a claim to the English throne as well. To the Catholic world, Mary was the rightful Queen of England. To Elizabeth, she was a living threat. Yet in these early years, Elizabeth's rule blossomed. Her treasury recovered through careful management and trade. Her navy grew stronger under captains who dreamed of distant oceans. The English Renaissance flowered around her, filling her court with music, poetry, and art. The people began to call her not merely their queen, but their good Queen Bess. And yet, even in triumph, she trusted no one completely. Princes, she once said, cannot bind themselves to keep faith, for they are forced to act for the safety of their people. Behind every smile, she measured risk. Her ladies of the bedchamber saw her long hours in solitude, her moments of reflection as she paced before the fire, hands clasped, weighing decisions that might save or doom thousands. At night, the palace fell into hush. The flicker of candlelight softened the hard lines of her crown, and she would rest her hand on a velvet map of her realm. She understood that England's security depended not on might, but on perception, on the illusion of strength, the performance of certainty. Her reign was theatre, and she was its most disciplined actress. There were days when doubt whispered like wind through the corridors. The memory of her imprisonment, of the tower's cold stones, lingered still. She had learned that mercy was fragile, that love could turn to death. These memories did not weaken her, they sharpened her. Each hesitation was calculated, each delay purposeful. To act too soon was to err, to act too late was to perish. Between those two edges, Elizabeth balanced her life. Visitors from across Europe often remarked on her contradictions. She was regal yet approachable, fierce yet playful. She could dismiss a suitor with a jest or humble a diplomat with a glance. Her wit was as dangerous as her temper was rare. "I keep my eyes open," she told one ambassador, "and I see through all men. They believed her. Still, her greatest strength was patience. She ruled by time, not force. When her advisors clamored for decisive wars or marriages, she reminded them that survival required endurance, not impulse. "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls," she repeated, her voice calm as water. "There is one Jesus Christ. The rest is trifles." In that single phrase, she distilled a lifetime's philosophy: faith without fanaticism, rule without tyranny. Years passed, and her presence grew mythic. Artists painted her in celestial robes, pearls around her neck, her hand resting upon the globe. To her subjects, she became more than mortal, an embodiment of England's rebirth. But behind that image was still the cautious girl who had once written by candlelight in captivity, who knew the value of silence and the peril of trust. Each dawn found her at work, reading reports, signing papers, annotating letters in her own sharp hand. She rose before most of her court, walked the galleries, and oversaw affairs of state with the precision of a scholar. She was both monarch and mind, guiding England through fragile peace. And though her courtiers adored her, they also feared her temper when patience ran thin. She expected excellence, demanded loyalty, and rewarded wit. The lessons of her youth never left her. She remembered what it was to be powerless, and she would never be powerless again. The orphan princess had become the sovereign of prudence, ruling not by sword or decree, but by the art of balance. Every gesture, every word, every silence was deliberate. By the time her reign reached its 10th year, Europe had begun to accept that Elizabeth Tudor was no passing phase but a force in her own right. The child of scandal had become the architect of stability. The girl who once walked to the Tower in fear now commanded ambassadors and generals, yet she knew that danger never vanished, it only changed its form. And so she watched, listened, and waited, her mind as sharp as the crown she wore. For in the corridors of power, caution was not cowardice, it was survival. The shadow of the Tower. The Tower of London had once been the scene of Elizabeth's near death, its grey stones soaked with the memories of her mother's blood and the echo of her own footsteps as a prisoner. In her mind, it stood as both a monument and a warning, a reminder that even a crown could become a cage. Now, as the Queen, she ruled in sight of that fortress, determined never again to see its gates close behind her. Yet the Tower's shadow stretched invisibly across her reign, not as a place of confinement, but as a metaphor for the constant peril of rule. In those early years of her sovereignty, Elizabeth discovered that fear was a currency. Her people, scarred by decades of tyranny and religious whiplash, longed for security. But beneath their hope lay unease. The fires of Mary's persecution still smoked in memory. The Protestant reformers who had survived the flames were zealous, hungry for vengeance. Meanwhile, the old Catholic families whispered of restoration. Every chapel, every sermon, every noble house in the countryside was a potential spark for rebellion. Elizabeth's challenge was not only to heal her country, but to control the image of herself as its healer. She knew she must appear divinely guided, yet humanly compassionate, strong yet merciful. This balance, impossible for most monarchs, became her art. She was never fully accessible, yet never distant enough to be feared. At public processions, she rode slowly through the streets, reaching out her gloved hand to bless the poor, her eyes luminous beneath the crown. To the onlookers, she was not merely a ruler, she was the rebirth of England itself, a living symbol of deliverance from chaos. But in private, she knew the Tower's shadow followed her. Conspiracies rose like tides. Her spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, kept his web of informants spread across Europe, intercepting letters, breaking ciphers, and uncovering plots that might have ended her life. Elizabeth trusted few, for she had learned that even affection could turn treacherous. The memory of Thomas Seymour's advances, of Mary's prison, and of her mother's execution had etched in her a deep wariness. The first great test of her rule came from within her own bloodline. Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, her mirror, and her opposite, had fled to England in 1568 after rebellion in her realm forced her abdication. To some, Mary was a tragic exile. To others, she was the rightful Catholic heir to England's throne. Her arrival was both a gift and a curse. Elizabeth, bound by kinship and royal decorum, could not turn her away, but to harbour her was to invite danger. At first, Elizabeth kept Mary under gentle confinement in the north, guarded but treated with dignity. She sent her fine clothes, musicians, and the courtesy of letters signed "Your loving cousin." But love was a word heavy with calculation. Elizabeth understood that as long as Mary lived, she was a rallying point for every Catholic power that dreamed of unseating England's Protestant queen. From Spain and Rome came whispers of invasion. From within England came the murmured hopes of those who still heard Mass in secret cellars. Rebellions flickered in the north, led by noble families who saw in Mary not a prisoner, but a banner. The rising of the north in 1569 brought thousands to arms under the sign of the 5 Wounds of Christ, demanding the restoration of the old faith and the release of their queen. Elizabeth, furious but composed, sent her armies north. The rebellion was crushed with ruthless efficiency. The heads of traitors were nailed above city gates, a grim reminder that the Tower's shadow belonged to her now. Mary, though uninvolved directly, became the unspoken centre of the storm. Her imprisonment tightened. Letters between her and her Catholic allies were intercepted by Walsingham's agents. Elizabeth hesitated to destroy her cousin outright, both for moral reasons and because she knew how history loved martyrs. Instead, she chose delay, that familiar weapon of hers, holding the problem in suspension, buying time until time itself might resolve it. But Mary was no ordinary captive. In her confinement, she played the role of the wronged queen with haunting skill, her beauty fading into melancholy legend. Foreign courts spoke of her as a saintly figure, wronged by a heretic usurper. Spain, France, and the papacy began to plot not merely for her release but for Elizabeth's removal. The Pope's bull regnans in Excelsis of 1570 excommunicated Elizabeth and released her subjects from allegiance to her, effectively painting a target on her life. The world, for a time, seemed to narrow into suspicion. Every knock at the gate, every candle flicker at night could have been the herald of a knife. Elizabeth, though outwardly serene, slept little. The Tower's shadow stretched across her dreams. She would awaken in her chambers at Richmond or Whitehall, the sound of the river murmuring beyond the windows, and remember how easily fortune could reverse. She had seen the heads of queens roll. She would not be the next. To survive, she turned to vigilance and intellect. Walsingham's intelligence network became her invisible armour. His spies infiltrated Catholic cells, mapped the movements of Jesuit priests, and uncovered networks of conspiracy that snaked from London to Madrid. Elizabeth encouraged this invisible war, though she always maintained an outward mask of peace. Her council debated executions. She hesitated, then consented only when necessity was absolute. To her, the preservation of her life was not selfishness, it was the preservation of England itself. The more danger surrounded her, the more luminous her public image became. Her portraits grew symbolic. Elizabeth painted as Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice, as Gloriana, radiant in armour, as the monarch whose gaze alone could command oceans. These were not mere vanities but instruments of power. The Queen had learned that the appearance of divine destiny could quell rebellion better than any sword. Yet behind that crafted divinity was still the cautious woman who remembered the Tower's chill. Her temper, though rarely unleashed, could silence an entire court. Her memory of slights was long, her forgiveness selective. Courtiers learned quickly that her favour was both precious and perilous. A misplaced word could undo years of service. A well-timed compliment could win her heart. She delighted in being courted by her counsellors and foreign envoys alike, a game that blurred politics with performance. Among the courtiers, none walked this delicate stage more deftly than Robert Dudley, now Earl of Leicester. His closeness to the Queen, his ambition, and his charm stirred both admiration and resentment. Gossip in Europe called him England's secret king. Ambassadors warned that his influence was dangerous. Yet Elizabeth balanced affection with authority. When Dudley's military expedition in the Netherlands faltered, she rebuked him publicly, reminding him that even her favourites were subject to her will. As years turned, England changed beneath her. The wounds of religious war began to scar over, if not heal. Trade expanded, Merchants grew rich on ventures to Muscovy, the Levant, and the New World. In London, theatres blossomed, and a new kind of English confidence stirred. Yet peace was never absolute. Across the seas, Spain grew hostile, its armadas swelling like thunderclouds. Within, Catholic agents plotted in cellars, smuggling in papal decrees and letters of treason. The greatest of these conspiracies, the Ridolfi plot of 1571, sought to replace Elizabeth with Mary, aided by Spanish troops. The plan failed, exposed by Walsingham's spies. The Duke of Norfolk, once among Elizabeth's trusted nobles, was executed. His fall sent a tremor through the realm. Even the highest blood was not immune. The Queen, though sorrowful, signed the warrant with steady hand. She wept afterward in private, but she did not waver. "The safety of many," she told Cecil, "depends upon the justice done to one." Her justice, though tempered with mercy, was always deliberate. She could wait years before striking, but when she did, it was final. That patience, born of the Tower's long nights, became her defining strategy. To rush was to risk ruin, to wait was to rule. The Tower itself, visible from her palace windows across the Thames, remained both symbol and threat. She used it as a warning, sending captured traitors through its gates to remind the nation of her authority. But she rarely visited. To walk those halls again would have been to confront ghosts she preferred to keep at distance, and yet, in a sense, she never left it. The Tower lived inside her, a presence reminding her that even power is fragile. The people, meanwhile, saw only her poise. They cheered her processions, sang her praises, and filled the streets on her birthdays. "God save the Queen!" they cried, and she would smile, knowing how fleeting adoration could be. Her face appeared on coins and tapestries. Her speeches were repeated like scripture. In Parliament, she spoke with unmatched eloquence, declaring, "Though I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, I have the heart and stomach of a king." The words electrified her subjects. They believed them because they saw in her a reflection of their own survival. But the Tower's shadow was lengthening again. Beyond the seas, King Philip II of Spain planned a reckoning for the heretic queen who had defied Rome. His empire stretched from the Americas to the Mediterranean. His armadas dominated the oceans. To him, Elizabeth was a stain upon divine order, a usurper whose death would restore God's favour. His ships gathered, his priests blessed the banners. The storm that would define her reign was building. Within her, the lessons of her youth sharpened to readiness. She knew that fear could be turned to courage if guided by conviction. She began strengthening her navy, investing in captains whose boldness matched her own: Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher. These men, once privateers skimming treasure from Spanish galleons, became instruments of national pride. Elizabeth, cautious yet visionary, saw in them not pirates but pioneers. She encouraged them quietly, balancing provocation with diplomacy, testing Spain's patience without plunging into war. Each evening, she reviewed letters by candlelight, the Tower's outline visible beyond the window. It was as if her past and her present shared the same horizon. She had once been its prisoner, now she commanded those who guarded its gates. The symmetry was not lost on her. She often said to her ladies, half in jest, "I know too well what it is to be watched." But in truth, she watched everyone in return. Her reign's middle years unfolded beneath that vigilance. The court glittered with poetry and intrigue, the theatres filled with voices praising England's golden age. Yet beneath the laughter of masks and music, Elizabeth felt the tremor of danger still. She would not be complacent. The Tower's shadow remained her teacher. It whispered that love could turn, faith could falter, and that even glory was fleeting. But it also whispered something more enduring, that she, the once orphaned child of scandal, had outlived them all, the traitors, the doubters, the tyrants. The Tower that once sought to break her had instead forged her into steel, and as the fires of rebellion died and the spectre of foreign invasion loomed, Elizabeth stood before her mirror in the dim light of evening. The face reflected there was lined with wisdom, the eyes steady, unblinking. Behind her, through the open window, the distant bells of the Tower chimed across the river. They were not the toll of fear now, but of sovereignty. The shadow that had once marked her weakness had become the emblem of her endurance. For as long as the tower stood, so too would England, and so too would she. The waiting years. The middle years of Elizabeth's reign unfolded like a long and careful breath drawn deep, held with infinite patience, and never quite exhaled. They were years defined not by sweeping victories or grand proclamations, but by restraint, by the discipline of waiting, watching, and choosing precisely when to act. It was during this long twilight of anticipation that the Queen's most subtle genius emerged. In the late 1570s and early 1580s, England stood at a crossroads. Abroad, the great powers of Europe, Spain and France, both Catholic empires, glared toward London with quiet hostility. At home, the nation's fragile peace trembled beneath the strain of religious division. Her ministers urged preemptive war, her courtiers whispered of alliances, her poets called for glory. Yet Elizabeth, still the cautious child of the Tower at heart, knew that haste could undo all she had built. Each morning, she rose before dawn in the chill quiet of her chambers, surrounded by the fragrance of beeswax candles and the faint sound of oars upon the Thames below. Her secretaries would bring dispatches from every corner of Europe. The Spanish ambassador's reports, coded letters from France, rumours from Scotland, messages from her own spies hidden within Catholic circles abroad. She read them all with a calm, methodical eye, marking margins in her precise hand. "Observe the men, not the words," she would say, meaning that truth lay in motive, not in speech. Patience was not weakness to her, it was power. The waiting years taught her that delay could shape events as surely as command. While others saw uncertainty as danger, she saw in it a weapon. It was in these years that she perfected the art of the pause that measured silence which made others reveal themselves. Her counsellors grew accustomed to her hesitations, those long contemplative moments where she seemed to drift into thought before speaking. Some mistook it for indecision. Those who knew her best understood it was calculation. The question of marriage still hung like a bright, immovable star above her reign. Europe watched to see which way she would turn toward alliance or solitude. Dozens of portraits were painted of potential suitors, princes from Austria, dukes from France, even the younger brother of Spain's King Philip. But Elizabeth, ever the strategist, wielded her unmarried state as a tool of negotiation. Each proposal dangled before her became leverage for diplomacy, a door she could open just enough to draw advantage, then close again before losing freedom. Among all her would-be suitors, one emerged as the most dangerous. Francois, Duke of Anjou, the younger brother of the King of France. He was younger than Elizabeth by 2 decades, vivacious, charming, and shrewd. Their flirtation played out across letters and banquets, an elaborate game of affection and politics. To the French court, the match promised alliance. To Elizabeth's people, it seemed absurd. She, the Virgin Queen, beloved of England, wed to a Catholic foreigner. Her council split in bitter debate. Cecil, ever prudent, warned that marriage could entangle England in continental wars. Leicester, though still favoured, grew jealous of the Frenchman's influence. The court pulsed with intrigue, every glance between queen and suitor dissected by eyes both loyal and treacherous. And yet, Elizabeth played her part with dazzling poise. At a masque held in Anjou's honour, she danced with him beneath a canopy of stars painted upon the ceiling. The courtiers whispered as she took his hand, pale, elegant, deliberate. The symbolism was irresistible. The sovereign and the suitor, the lion and the fleur-de-lis, united in spectacle, if not in spirit. When Anjou called her his ma maîtresse, she smiled, neither confirming nor denying affection. Her power lay in ambiguity. In the end, it was Elizabeth who decided the ending. In 1581, she dismissed the match, her eyes shining with a strange tenderness as she told Anjou farewell. "I will never marry," she said softly, "for I am already bound to a husband the kingdom of England." The words travelled across Europe, sealing her legend. From that day forward, she became the eternal bride of her realm, untouchable, inviolate, yet endlessly desired. But these were not years of idleness. While she danced and debated, she was also building the silent foundations of strength. Her navy expanded, her finances steadied, her diplomats sowed subtle alliances that balanced Spain's might. England, once a minor player in European politics, was now a force to be reckoned with, not through conquest, but through strategy. Still, the peace was a fragile illusion. Across the northern border, Mary, Queen of Scots, languished in her gilded prison. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth had kept her cousin under guard, an uneasy compromise between mercy and necessity. Yet Mary's presence was a festering wound. Each year brought new conspiracies invoking her name, new letters intercepted, new plots uncovered. The Babington plot of 1586 was the breaking point. It was uncovered by Walsingham's spies, a web of deceit so intricate that even modern intrigue could scarcely match it. Letters had been smuggled to Mary in beer barrels, written in cipher, urging her to approve a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and seize the throne. When Walsingham deciphered the code and placed the damning evidence before the Queen, the room fell silent. Elizabeth read the letters again and again, her face expressionless. She knew what they meant. She also knew what her decision would cost. For all their rivalry, Mary was still kin, still the daughter of her father's bloodline. To execute her cousin was to cross a moral threshold from which she could never return. For days, Elizabeth paced her chambers, torn between fear and sorrow. Her counsel pressed her to act, arguing that as long as Mary lived, England was not safe. At last, her resolve hardened. "If it must be," she said, "then let it be done not by my hand, but by the law." On the 8th of February 1587, Mary was led to the scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle. Witnesses described her as serene, robed in crimson, the colour of martyrdom. She spoke of faith and forgiveness, then knelt, her lips murmuring a prayer. When the axe fell, the echo travelled through England like a thunderclap. Elizabeth's reaction was complex, almost contradictory. When news of the execution reached her, she wept, furious that her ministers had acted too quickly. She raged at Cecil and Walsingham, insisting she had not explicitly commanded the deed. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps performance. Yet in her private writings, a quieter truth emerged. She had known the end was inevitable. "She sought my death," Elizabeth wrote, "and by law is condemned. Yet I am not made lighter for it." Mary's death was more than the end of a rival. It marked the end of Elizabeth's long balancing act between leniency and survival. With her cousin's blood, she had paid the price for England's safety, but it also hardened her reign. From that day forward, she would rule without illusion of mercy. Beyond England's shores, the reaction was volcanic. Spain, already seething, took the execution as divine justification for invasion. King Philip II began assembling the most formidable fleet Europe had ever seen, the Armada that would bear the cross of Christ and the vengeance of Rome to English shores. Elizabeth, ever the student of fate, sensed the coming storm. The waiting years were ending. All her patience, all her lessons in restraint, had been preparation for the reckoning that now approached. The shadow that had haunted her since childhood was about to take form in sails and steel. Still, she refused to yield to fear. "I do not fear to die among my people," she told her council when the threat became known. "We shall meet them not with prayer alone, but with valour." It was the language of a warrior queen, though her true weapon remained her mind. While her admirals, Howard, Drake, and Hawkins readied the fleet, Elizabeth turned her attention to the heart of her people. She knew morale could win where cannon might fail. Her speeches to her troops, her letters to her subjects, radiated calm defiance. "God will defend the right," she wrote, "if we but stand together as one." And so she waited once more the eternal lesson of her life. While the winds gathered and the Spanish Armada creaked its way across the Atlantic, Elizabeth remained steady, like a flame unshaken by the storm. The girl who had once survived the Tower by silence now ruled an empire by composure. It was this paradox, this union of patience and will, that transformed her from monarch to myth. The waiting years, which seemed to many like inaction, were in truth the crucible of her greatness. Through every hesitation, every pause, every unspoken decision, she had prepared herself and her nation for the trial that would define them both. When she walked the galleries of Whitehall at night, the candlelight catching the jewels at her throat, she must have felt the echoes of those who had doubted her. The courtiers who once whispered that a woman could not rule, the ambassadors who predicted her fall, the priests who prayed for her death. Yet she endured not by conquest, but by control. And as the winds began to rise over the Channel, as Spain's mighty fleet assembled like a thundercloud on the horizon, Elizabeth's patience reached its purpose. The long vigil was over. The waiting years had done their work. Now, at last, the storm would come, and she was ready to meet it. The Queen ascends. The summer of 1588 dawned beneath skies heavy with portent, and the salt wind that swept across the Channel carried with it the scent of destiny. For 30 years, Elizabeth Tudor had ruled through patience and intellect, steering England from the edge of civil war toward a fragile prosperity. But now, the waiting was done. On the horizon rose the Armada of Spain, 130 ships strong, their masts bristling like a forest of spears, their decks filled with soldiers, priests, and the weight of a nation's wrath. The Spanish Armada was not merely an invasion fleet, it was an act of divine theatre. King Philip II of Spain saw himself as God's chosen avenger, the hand that would crush heresy and restore the true faith to England. To his admirals, the mission was as much holy as political, to dethrone the bastard queen who had defied Rome, executed her cousin Mary, and set herself as head of the church. Their banners bore the cross of Burgundy, their decks resounded with hymns, they sailed, they believed, with heaven behind them. In London, news of their approach spread like a fever. Bells tolled, messengers galloped through the streets, and the people gathered in marketplaces, whispering prayers and fears. England, still small beside the vast Spanish Empire, trembled at the thought of annihilation. The Queen's ministers urged her to retreat inland for safety. But Elizabeth, who had waited her whole life to face destiny, refused. She remembered too well the power of appearances, the way fear could poison armies faster than plague. "My place is with my people," she said. "If I die among them." Her words were calm, not defiant, the voice of a woman who had lived too long with death to fear its coming. At Tilbury, on the estuary of the Thames where her soldiers assembled, the Queen rode among her troops astride a white horse. She wore a silver cuirass over her gown, the sunlight glinting from its polished surface. The men, rough farmers and sailors who had come to defend their island, fell silent as she appeared. The air smelled of iron and mud, of sweat and gunpowder. Then Elizabeth spoke, her voice carrying over the clatter of armour and the creak of standards in the wind. "My loving people," she began, "we have been persuaded by some that we are careful of our safety, and that we should take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people." She paused, lifting her gaze to the horizon, where smoke from the ships rose like a bruise against the sky. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she continued, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." The crowd erupted in cheers. Some wept, others beat their pikes against the earth. In that moment, the frail-seeming queen became a figure of myth, half warrior, half mother of the nation. The speech was brief, but its echo would last for centuries. As she returned to her tent, the sky darkened with storm clouds. Across the Channel, the Armada fought the elements as much as England's navy. Sir Francis Drake, commanding from the Revenge, used fire and wind to turn the battle. His smaller, swifter ships harried the Spaniards, breaking their formation, setting their vessels ablaze with fire ships that drifted like ghosts through the night. The sea roared with cannon thunder, flashes of flame lighting the rain like lightning. Elizabeth did not witness the battle, but she lived every hour of it through the dispatches that reached her table. She read each message by candlelight, her expression unreadable, her mind steady. When word came that the Armada had been driven north by storm, she whispered only, "God breathed," and they were scattered. It was both gratitude and judgment, a monarch's prayer turned into poetry. The victory at sea transformed her kingdom. England, long overshadowed by the great empires of Europe, had stood against the strongest power in Christendom and prevailed. It was a triumph of courage, weather, and chance, but also of vision. Elizabeth's patience, her investments in the navy, her refusal to act rashly, all had led to this moment. The storm that had threatened to destroy her realm instead crowned it in glory. In London, the bells rang for days, bonfires blazed on every hilltop, psalms filled the churches. To her people, Elizabeth was no longer merely queen, she was chosen by Providence. The Virgin Queen had defended her island through the grace of heaven. The myth of Gloriana, goddess and sovereign, took root. Yet behind the celebrations, Elizabeth remained cautious. She knew how fragile victory could be. Spain's might was not broken, merely bruised. War could return. The coffers were strained, the navy battered. She thanked her captains and paid her soldiers, but she did not allow triumph to cloud judgment. In her council chambers, she warned against pride. "We are delivered," she said, "but not secure." Still, the image of Tilbury became eternal. Painters captured her in silver armour, poets compared her to Astrea, the goddess of justice returned to earth. Even Shakespeare, rising in the years to come, would echo her strength in his heroines. The nation's identity, brave, independent, defiant, began to form around her like a cloak. The years that followed the Armada's defeat were Elizabeth's zenith. The air of her court shimmered with confidence. Explorers sailed under her banner to the edges of the known world. Drake around the globe, Raleigh to the shores of Virginia. The map of empire began in those voyages. At home, theatres blossomed, universities thrived, and the English language found new beauty. The Queen encouraged these arts not merely from vanity, but from wisdom. She understood that glory, once kindled in the mind, was as vital to a nation as gold in the treasury. But success brought new complexities. The cult of Gloriana of the Virgin Queen grew so radiant that it began to obscure the woman herself. Courtiers knelt not only before their ruler but before an idea, a vision of eternal youth and wisdom. Elizabeth, nearing 60, maintained the illusion with care. Her portraits grew increasingly symbolic. The rainbow portrait, with its eyes and ears embroidered upon her gown, declared her omniscience. The Ditchley portrait showed her standing upon a globe, unbowed by clouds and storm. Behind the paintings, however, time was at work. The Queen, who had once danced until dawn, now walked more slowly through the halls of Whitehall. Her temper, always sharp, could flash like steel when crossed. The courtiers who once flattered her beauty now praised her wisdom. She heard the shift, and it stung. Robert Dudley, her beloved companion for decades, died in 1588, just weeks after the Armada's defeat. The letter he sent her shortly before his death, addressed simply "his last letter," was found years later in a box beside her bed, the ink worn by her touch. With his passing, something in her private heart closed forever. She would never again allow another to stand so near. As she aged, loneliness became her constant shadow. The halls of her palaces echoed with the laughter of younger courtiers, men like the Earl of Essex, whose boldness reminded her of Dudley's youth. Essex, brilliant and reckless, won her admiration, then her fury. He embodied the new generation, ambitious, impatient, eager for war. To him, Elizabeth seemed too cautious, too bound by her methods of delay. To her, Essex was a spark too near the powder. Their relationship burned hot and cold, a cycle of affection and rebellion. When he disobeyed her orders during the Irish campaign and returned without leave, Elizabeth's patience finally snapped. In 1601, Essex led a desperate, ill-fated revolt in London, hoping to seize power. His capture and execution broke her heart, but not her will. "A queen does not weep for traitors," she told her ladies afterward, though tears glistened in her eyes. The years drew on, and her realm continued to prosper, even as her body weakened. She presided over the flowering of England's soul, the plays of Shakespeare, the voyages that would seed an empire, the stability that allowed art and faith to coexist. Yet she felt the isolation that crowns demand. In the long winter evenings, she sat before the fire, wrapped in velvet, listening to musicians play the old dances of her youth. The courtiers would look upon her face, still painted white with the mask of ceremony, and wonder what thoughts moved behind those watchful eyes. Sometimes, in her solitude, she walked to the windows of Richmond Palace and gazed out across the river. The mist curled above the water, just as it had when she was a child at Hatfield. She thought of her father, of Anne Boleyn, of the Tower. She thought of the long road she had walked from the orphaned daughter of disgrace to the monarch of a golden age. Few rulers had conquered so much by doing so little. Fewer still had wielded patience as a weapon sharper than any sword. When she addressed Parliament in her final years, her voice trembled but her mind was still clear. "There will never queen sit in this seat with more zeal to protect you," she said, "nor a more loving heart." Those who heard her wept openly. They understood that the woman who had carried England through tempest and treachery was nearing her rest. By 1603, her health was failing. She withdrew to Richmond, refusing food, speaking little. "I am weary," she whispered once, "of life and of the world." She would not take to her bed, fearing that to lie down was to surrender. For days she stood silent, lost in thought, as if listening to the echo of her own reign. At last, she sank into sleep, surrounded by her ladies, the weight of 45 years of rule upon her. When she died, England mourned not only its queen but its age. The child of a fallen mother, the prisoner of the Tower, the cautious monarch who outweighted empires, her life had been the measure of endurance itself. As her coffin was borne to Westminster, the people lined the streets in silence, their tears glinting in the pale spring light. The crown passed to James of Scotland, uniting the realms she had once held apart. But the memory of Elizabeth endured stronger than walls, brighter than banners. Her name became legend, her era the standard by which all others would be judged. And far across the sea, in every port where English ships sailed, the wind carried her legacy, still the courage of an island queen who had outlasted kings, storms, and centuries, healing a broken realm. When the crown first settled on Elizabeth's head, it was not the symbol of triumph that the pageants made it seem. It was a burden of contradictions, a circle of gold forged from conflict, betrayal, and blood. England, when she inherited it, was a wounded land, scarred by decades of religious war, impoverished by reckless kings, and hollowed by fear. The smoke of Mary's burning still clung to the air. The ashes of Protestant martyrs drifted in the memory of the people. Catholics hid in cellars to whisper the Latin Mass, while Protestants sharpened their words like blades against Rome. The fields were lean, the treasury nearly empty, and the throne itself trembled under the weight of doubt. Yet Elizabeth did not flinch. She understood that the first task of her reign was not conquest abroad, but healing at home. And healing, as she knew from her own life, required both patience and precision. She began with faith the wound that had torn England's heart in two. Her father had severed the kingdom from the Pope. Her sister had tried to weld it back with fire. Elizabeth chose neither path completely. Her genius lay in compromise, not fanaticism. In the spring of 1559, she called her first parliament to craft what would be known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. It was not, as many had hoped, a clear answer to England's theological chaos. It was, rather, a work of delicate architecture, a structure designed to stand, if not perfectly, at least securely, between two warring extremes. The Act of Supremacy restored the monarch's authority over the Church, declaring Elizabeth the supreme governor of the Church of England, a title carefully chosen. Governor, not head, for the word head had been her father's, and it stung Catholic ears. It was her first act of careful ambiguity, enough to affirm independence from Rome, yet subtle enough to avoid outrage. The Act of Uniformity followed, mandating that all services use a revised version of the Book of Common Prayer. Its language was elegant in its moderation, Protestant in theology, yet shaded with familiar phrases to soothe the hearts of those who still missed Latin rhythm and incense. "I have no desire," she told her council, "to make windows into men's souls. Faith," she believed, "should be quiet, private, inward, between conscience and God." Her settlement did not please everyone. Zealous Protestants grumbled that it smelled too much of Rome. Staunch Catholics condemned it as heresy, but it held. It kept England from fracturing once again. The fires of persecution dimmed. The gallows of heresy stood unused. The people, exhausted by certainty, embraced peace through compromise. In the churches, the sound of English psalms replaced the mutter of Latin. The clergy learned to bend instead of break. Priests married. Monasteries remained silent. The parish bells that had once tolled for Mass now called the faithful to prayer in their own tongue. For the first time in decades, England could pray without fear of the knock at the door. Elizabeth's religious policy was not born of piety alone. She believed, as a stateswoman, that unity of worship meant unity of rule. A divided faith was a divided loyalty, and divided loyalty meant rebellion. "There is one Jesus Christ," she once said to Parliament. "The rest is trifles." It was not theology, but governance. The principle that the crown and the altar must not be enemies. Even so, she did not mistake peace for love. Beneath the surface, calm, resentment simmered. The old Catholic gentry still plotted in shadows. Jesuit missionaries slipped into England disguised as merchants or tutors. Each year, her spies uncovered secret masses, coded letters, and whispered treasons. Elizabeth's response was measured but firm. She did not burn them as Mary had done. She watched, she waited, and when she struck, it was surgical. The rack in the tower creaked rarely, but decisively. Her balance between mercy and control became the rhythm of her reign. When the Pope excommunicated her in 1570, declaring her illegitimate and releasing her subjects from obedience, she did not rage. She smiled. "The Pope," she said dryly, "may decree what he will in Rome. I rule what I will in England." Her words, calm as ever, carried the weight of unbreakable sovereignty. Religion, however, was only one fracture in the body of the realm. The economy, too, demanded healing. Decades of mismanagement had drained the treasury, and inflation gnawed at the coinage. The silver shillings of Henry's time had been debased into copper ghosts. Elizabeth's council, under the careful genius of William Cecil, set about restoring stability. They revalued the currency, tightened expenditures, and encouraged trade. The merchants of London, who had once looked abroad with hesitation, now ventured to new markets. The seeds of empire, the East India Company, the voyages of Hawkins and Drake, sprang from this soil of restored confidence. The Queen watched these ventures with cautious pride. Though she was no merchant, she understood commerce as a form of diplomacy, a way to make England powerful without war. The ships that carried cloth and tin across the seas also carried the English tongue, the English Bible, and the legend of English liberty. "We shall find wealth," she told her council, "not in gold, but in the industry of our people." Her court reflected this same energy. It became a mirror of her kingdom, glittering, restless, alive with contradictions. There, noblemen debated philosophy beneath painted ceilings, while spies listened behind tapestries. Musicians composed madrigals to her beauty. Poets disguised flattery as devotion. Sir Walter Raleigh scattered his cloak across the mud for her, and Francis Bacon analysed her every word like scripture. The air at court shimmered with ambition and intellect. But Elizabeth, though surrounded by adoration, remained alone at its centre. She had long ago learned that affection could be dangerous. "I am married to England," she reminded her favourites when they grew too bold. Her celibacy was both vow and strategy, a symbol of purity that elevated her above the lusts and intrigues of men. Her courtiers called her the Virgin Queen, and the poets turned the phrase into divine myth. To them, she was not a woman but an emblem, an eternal goddess clothed in ermine and wisdom. This mythology served her well. The cult of Gloriana unified a nation still unsure of its faith. Painters depicted her surrounded by suns and symbols, untouched by age. The people began to see her not merely as sovereign, but as destiny incarnate. Even the weather seemed to favour her. When storms sank Spanish ships or spoiled foreign harvests, it was said that God bloweth for England's queen. And yet, beneath the splendour, Elizabeth remained human. Her temper could flare with the heat of her father's blood. Her anxieties could gnaw like frost. She feared betrayal more than death. She tested her ministers, rewarding loyalty, punishing deceit. Cecil, faithful until age bent his shoulders, was her anchor, but even he learned that to cross her was perilous. "You are my eyes," she told him once, "but I shall not be blind." Her patience, so often praised, was not serenity but control. She could smile while rage burned behind her eyes. She could wait years for revenge if necessity demanded. She forgave slowly and forgot nothing. Yet those who earned her trust found it unbreakable. Her ladies of the bedchamber, who saw her without the mask of majesty, spoke of moments of startling tenderness. She would laugh, tease, and listen to gossip like any mortal woman. But when the crown was set upon her hair, that warmth vanished. She became again the figure of marble and flame. In those first years of healing, Elizabeth walked a path between memory and hope. The ghosts of the past, her mother, her father, her sister, haunted her, yet she would not let them rule her. The crown that had destroyed so many became her redemption. The kingdom that had nearly killed her became her life's purpose. As her reign lengthened, England began to change beneath her steady hand. The villages grew safer, the ports busier, the air freer of fear. Children born under her rule had never known the smoke of burning heretics. Farmers planted in confidence. Scholars wrote without censorship. "God Save the Queen" became not merely a prayer but a statement of identity. She was England, and England was her. And yet, she knew that peace was a fragile thing. It had to be guarded, fed, and watched, lest it rot into complacency. So she never ceased her vigilance. Each night, as the palace candles guttered low, she would stand before the great windows of Whitehall, her reflection mingling with the lights of London across the river. The Thames flowed dark and endless beneath her gaze, as it had when she was a child in her father's palace. She would rest one hand on the cold glass and whisper, "So long as I breathe, England shall stand." That vow, half prayer, half prophecy, became the unseen pulse of her reign. For though her crown was gilded in ceremony, its foundation was labour, calculation, and faith in the endurance of her people. The broken realm she had inherited was mending, slow but sure, under her steady light. And in that long, luminous dawn of her rule, Elizabeth began to transform from queen into legend, not through conquest or miracles, but through the quieter miracle of survival, the art of rule. Elizabeth Tudor ruled not through domination, nor through divine decree alone, but through the subtle and glittering art of presence, a kind of living theatre where every gesture, every silence, and every carefully chosen word carried the weight of empire. She was both sovereign and symbol, actress and audience, weaving politics into performance so masterfully that even her enemies could not quite tell where the woman ended and the monarch began. In the long, steady decades after her first triumphs, this art of rule became her masterpiece. By the mid-1572, her court had evolved into a spectacle unlike any other in Europe. It was not merely a place of governance, but a stage upon which loyalty, ambition, and desire were played out with exquisite tension. Courtiers arrived at dawn in silken finery, rehearsing their flattery as actors might rehearse lines. The air smelled of rosewater and intrigue, the sound of lutes and whispered alliances blending into the same gentle hum. Yet behind the perfume and poetry lay a machine of astonishing control, a monarch who saw and remembered everything. Elizabeth understood that to rule men, she must fascinate them. Power was not enough. It had to be adored. She was the axis around which all moved untouchable, radiant, and unpredictable. "I will have here," she once said to her ladies, "no man think me easy to please. I must be sought, as heaven is sought by labour and by love." Her charisma was legend. To foreign ambassadors, she could appear as serene as a saint. To her courtiers, she was fire and wit embodied. When she laughed, it was said the room itself seemed brighter. When she frowned, silence spread like frost. Yet all of it, the laughter, the glances, the affection, were instruments in her orchestra of authority. Among her closest courtiers, none knew this art better than Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Their relationship had matured into something layered and enduring, a mixture of friendship, love, rivalry, and memory. He had been her companion since youth, her mirror in charm and confidence. Now, as they both aged, their bond deepened into something quieter, but no less powerful. They understood each other's ambitions. They spoke the language of survival fluently. When he died in 1588, she lost not merely a courtier but her most intimate reflection. After Leicester's death, Elizabeth leaned increasingly upon her council. Men like William Cecil, now ennobled as Lord Burghley, and his son Robert, who inherited his father's precision and restraint. They were her anchors amid the tide of flatterers. Yet even they sometimes struggled to navigate her moods. She could praise a man with a smile in the morning and dismiss him by dusk for a single misstep. Loyalty to Elizabeth meant endurance, not devotion alone. She demanded to be seen, to be known, to be celebrated yet never fully understood. When courtiers sought her favour through gifts, she examined each offering with the eye of a strategist. A jewel was never only decoration, it was a message. A sonnet was not mere praise, but proof of allegiance. The poets of her time, Edmund Spenser, Philip Sidney, and later William Shakespeare, learned to drape their tributes in allegory, turning flattery into national myth. In The Fairy Queen, Spenser cast her as Gloriana, the embodiment of virtue and majesty. In Sidney's Arcadia, she was the unattainable ideal. The Queen read their works with wry amusement, sometimes annotating margins with her own thoughts. Too much, she might write beside a particularly effusive verse, or well said beside a line that pleased her. It was not vanity that drove her to sustain this aura, it was policy. The image of the Virgin Queen, radiant and pure, became a kind of armour. It elevated her above marriage, above scandal, and above the divisions of faith. In a Europe dominated by kings, she had turned her singleness into supremacy. Her body was her nation's metaphor unclaimed, inviolate, incorruptible. The cult of Gloriana, though born of poetry, became a political reality. She knew, too, how to wield affection as a leash. Her favourites competed for her gaze as knights once fought for holy relics. To one she gave a ring, to another a smile that could undo years of doubt. She kept them near, but never close enough to forget their distance. When Francis Bacon sought greater office through flattery, she teased him, "You are too bold, sir." When Essex pressed her to act rashly in Ireland, she struck him across the face before a startled council, her pride as fierce as her love once had been. Elizabeth ruled through contrasts, gentleness and fury, reason and passion, mercy and calculation. She could kneel before her people in humility and stand before princes with the hauteur of a goddess. To Spain, she was the heretic usurper, to France the wary ally, to her own people, the steadfast mother of the realm. Every version of herself was true, for she had long ago learned to become whatever England required. Her mastery of ceremony was unmatched. The court's festivals, progresses, and masques became living symbols of her reign. Each summer, she journeyed through her kingdom, visiting noble estates, transforming the countryside into theatre. Lords bankrupted themselves to entertain her, building triumphal arches and setting entire lakes ablaze with floating fireworks. The people thronged to see her carriage pass, kneeling as she rode by. To them, she was not flesh and blood, but something mythic, a vision of England's glory rendered in gold and white. At Kenilworth, in 1575, Leicester outdid all others in homage. For nearly 3 weeks, his estate became a world of enchantment. Music by day, fireworks by night, banquets upon floating barges. Actors dressed as nymphs, and gods hailed the Queen as Venus herself. Elizabeth smiled through it all, her laughter ringing like bells. But when the final revel ended and the torches guttered out, she left without a word of promise. For her, love was spectacle, not surrender. This art of distance defined her diplomacy as well. Foreign ambassadors often left her presence both charmed and confounded. The Spanish envoys called her the mistress of delay, for she could turn negotiation into a labyrinth of wit and waiting. When France pressed her to marry their duke, she flirted with possibility for years, extracting concessions without ever saying yes. When Scotland tested her patience, she answered with letters laced in honey and iron. "I mean no harm," she would write, "so long as I am not harmed." Her words were always exact, never more, never less than what she wished to reveal. The pageantry of her rule extended even to her appearance. Each day, her dressing ritual was a ceremony of state. Her ladies would lace her gowns of velvet and brocade, set pearls in her hair, and paint her face with the pale white lead that masked age but invited whispers. The mirror reflected not merely a woman but a symbol constructed from endurance and will. She once told her painter, Nicholas Hilliard, "Paint me no shadows, I am made of light." That light, however, had begun to burn against the lengthening shadows of time. In her later years, Elizabeth's vanity deepened into something fragile. Her courtiers, fearful of her displeasure, exaggerated their praise until truth became theatre. When one lady accidentally referred to the Queen's younger days, Elizabeth's eyes flashed like drawn steel. "You think me old?" she asked, and the room froze. Yet behind that pride lay melancholy. She had outlived those who had once shared her laughter: Dudley, Walsingham, even Burghley. The courtiers who now surrounded her were strangers to her youth. The mask of Gloriana was all that remained, and she wore it because without it she would be mortal again. Despite her isolation, her mind remained as sharp as ever. She attended to matters of state with the same discipline she had at 25. Reports flowed across her desk daily, from Ireland, from the Low Countries, from the New World. She read them all, annotating in her tight, spidery script. "This I like not. Seek proof. Let it rest." No decision was made without her touch. Her ministers, impatient for quicker action, sometimes grumbled at her delays. "Madam," Essex once dared to say, "time presses." "My time," she replied, "is my own." That reply, simple as it was, contained the secret of her reign. She had survived by mastering time, by bending it to her will, stretching it between indecision and command until her enemies exhausted themselves. Where others acted, she waited. Where others rushed, she endured. She knew that history belonged not to those who shouted loudest, but to those who lasted longest. The poets who flourished under her reign understood this instinctively. They wrote of her as an eternal presence, a light that neither flickered nor faded. In their words, she became England itself constant amid change, sovereign of the sea and the soul. It was this image, as much as her politics, that forged the myth of the Elizabethan age. But every myth carries its price. The loneliness that shadowed her heart deepened with the years. At night, in her chambers, when the courtiers had gone and the musicians' last notes had died, she would remove her jewels one by one, setting each crown and chain upon the table. Beneath the paint and pearls, the face that looked back from the mirror was not Gloriana's, but Elizabeth's tired, lined, human. Sometimes she would sigh, whispering the Latin of her youth. "Sic transit gloria mundi, so passes the glory of the world." Yet dawn always found her reborn. When the doors of the council chamber opened, she was again the sovereign who had outwitted kings, defied popes, and commanded the loyalty of millions. She had turned her own frailty into strength, her singleness into sanctity, her image into immortality. That was the art of her rule, not conquest, but creation, not force, but fascination. She understood that history remembers not the sword, but the story. And in shaping that story and becoming her own legend, Elizabeth had done what few monarchs ever achieved. She had made herself eternal, faces of devotion and betrayal. In the twilight of Elizabeth's reign, when the fires of youth had cooled into the steady glow of mastery, the Queen's world became one of masks, faces smiling by candlelight, words gilded with loyalty, hearts hidden behind velvet and lace. Her court was both a theatre and a trap, filled with men who loved her, served her, envied her, and sometimes sought to undo her. Devotion and betrayal were twin stars orbiting her crown, and she, ever the consummate player, knew how to balance between them. The aging monarch still dazzled all who approached her. Though her red gold hair was now a carefully kept illusion of wigs and jewels, her presence remained magnetic. When she entered a room, every eye turned toward her. Conversation stopped as though a flame had entered among shadows. But those who truly served her, her ministers, her ladies, her poets, knew that behind that glow lay a mind grown more private and a heart more cautious than ever. After the defeat of the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth's power seemed unassailable. Her navy ruled the seas, her people adored her, her enemies licked their wounds across the water. Yet peace was not as simple as victory. War with Spain lingered on in costly skirmishes. The Irish question remained unresolved. And at home, ambition brewed restlessly within her glittering court. The new generation of nobles, young, fiery, untested, had never known the fear that shaped her. They saw her patience as hesitation, her caution as weakness. Chief among them was Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. He had risen like a comet, brilliant and reckless, his confidence equal to his beauty. To Elizabeth, he was the ghost of Robert Dudley, reborn bold, captivating, dangerous. She saw in him the charm and vigour of her youth, and perhaps the echo of what might have been had she not chosen solitude as her crown. He, in turn, saw in her a mirror of power and an obstacle. Their relationship began as a dance of fascination. Essex flattered her endlessly, calling her "my goddess," writing her letters filled with devotion. In return, she gave him titles, lands, and command. When he spoke to her, she softened. When he turned away, jealousy flickered in her heart like a forbidden ember. But Essex was no Dudley. He lacked the older man's discipline and respect for the delicate balance of the Queen's pride. He was a soldier of impulse, born for the battlefield, not the council chamber. In 1596, she sent him to command an expedition against Spain. At first, success crowned his efforts. Cadiz fell to English forces, the Spanish fleet burned in harbour, and Essex returned a hero. London rang with his name. Ballads were sung in his honour. Yet the Queen, wary of vanity, withheld the rewards he expected. She saw how easily triumph could curdle into arrogance. When Essex demanded a seat on the Council of War and greater authority, she rebuked him sharply. "When we have need of such a subject," she told him coolly, "we will send for you." The sting of her words cut deep. Essex began to resent the restraint of a woman he believed past her prime. Around him, a faction of young nobles and poets, restless, ambitious, eager for glory, whispered that England needed fresh blood. They saw themselves as knights of a fading age, heirs to the future. Elizabeth, they murmured, had once been the morning star, now she was the lingering dusk. But the Queen still knew how to rule men's hearts. When Essex stormed from her presence, she sent for him days later, allowing reconciliation to come as both mercy and lesson. "My lord," she said softly, "anger is not wise in those who must command." Her words soothed him, but only for a time. Their bond grew ever more volatile, oscillating between affection and fury. He teased her vanity, she tested his loyalty. When he turned his back in council, she boxed his ears before her astonished ministers. When he begged forgiveness, she granted it with a sigh that seemed both maternal and weary. "You may be my child," she told him once, "but you forget that I am your queen." In truth, she loved him as she loved all her favourites with passion restrained by pride. He reminded her of life's warmth, even as he threatened its order. For Elizabeth, who had sacrificed companionship for power, such love was both solace and torment. Each of her courtiers served as a reflection of her own contradictions, the fire she could not touch, the youth she could not reclaim. Meanwhile, the realm itself mirrored the turbulence of her court. The wars in Ireland deepened, draining treasure and morale. The rebellion of Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, demanded yet another campaign, and in 1599 Essex pleaded for command. Elizabeth, against her better judgment, allowed it. "If you fail me," she warned, "you will have broken more than peace." He knelt, kissed her hand, and swore devotion. His failure came swiftly. In Ireland, Essex hesitated, negotiated, and finally withdrew without decisive battle. The Queen's patience broke. He was recalled to London in disgrace, stripped of his posts, and confined to his house under guard. In desperation, he forced his way into her chambers unannounced, finding her without her royal mask, hair undone, face unpainted, the fragile body of an old woman revealed. The moment destroyed the illusion that had bound them. For the first time, he saw not Gloriana, but Elizabeth mortal, aging, weary. She never forgave him for that glimpse. Banished from court, Essex's pride curdled into rebellion. Surrounded by desperate allies, he plotted a coup to seize power and force her to name him successor. It was a fool's dream, born of wounded vanity. In February 1601, he marched through London with a few hundred followers, shouting that the Queen's council had betrayed her. The city did not rise. His men scattered. By nightfall, he was captured. Elizabeth, upon hearing the news, sat in silence for a long while. "He sought to rise," she said at last, "and now he shall fall." She signed his death warrant with trembling hand, knowing what it meant not only the loss of a traitor, but of the last man she had ever truly loved. On the morning of his execution, Essex sent her a ring, a token of their bond, but it never reached her. The messenger who carried it feared the Queen's wrath and kept it hidden until years after her death. When she learned of this, too late, Elizabeth wept bitterly. "Had I but known," she whispered, "I would have spared him." The Queen, who had survived kings, popes and armies, was undone at last by secrecy and pride. The memory haunted her until her final days. Essex's fall marked the end of the passionate age of her court. The younger courtiers, chastened, withdrew into obedience. The old guard, Burghley, Walsingham, Raleigh, were either dead or diminished. Elizabeth stood alone, surrounded by flattery she no longer trusted and faces she could not read. Her realm still thrived, her people still adored her, but her inner circle had grown cold. She moved through the glittering halls of Whitehall like a spectre of her own glory. The musicians still played, the poets still wrote, but the laughter was hollow. At banquets, she smiled and raised her cup, yet drank little. Her ladies whispered that she no longer slept. She would walk for hours, murmuring prayers or fragments of Latin verse. "The past," she said once, "is a foreign country where I am always welcome." In her solitude, she returned to the things that had always sustained her: her faith in reason, her love of learning, her devotion to England itself. She read scripture, Seneca, and histories of Rome. She found solace in the endurance of those who, like her, had ruled through will rather than affection. "Time," she wrote in the margin of one book, "is the test of all things." But time was testing her too. The courtiers who had once praised her beauty now praised her wisdom. The songs written in her honour became elegies. Her reflection in the mirror grew pale, her body frail. The weight of 40 years of rule pressed upon her shoulders, yet she refused to surrender to weakness. Even as her strength waned, she kept her sharp tongue and sharper humour. When one ambassador dared to hint at her age, she replied, "I am as young as ever, for kings cannot grow old." Beneath the bravado, however, lay exhaustion. The betrayals of her later years, Essex's rebellion, Raleigh's disobedience, the endless intrigues of succession had eroded her spirit. The loneliness she had chosen as protection now closed around her like ice. The throne, once her triumph, had become her prison. She had sacrificed love for sovereignty, companionship for command. Now, surrounded by courtiers who spoke her praises yet mourned her in secret, she began to understand the cost. Still, she never relinquished control. Even in despair, she ruled with precision. She approved laws, signed treaties, and read every dispatch. Her mind, though burdened, remained formidable. "I see all and say nothing," she told a visitor the same creed that had carried her from the tower to the throne. When the court celebrated her 71st birthday, she wore a gown of silver lace and pearls, the same colours she had worn at Tilbury decades before. "Is it not fitting," she murmured to her ladies, "that a queen should end as she began, clothed in light?" The remark was wistful, not vain. She knew that the light was fading, but she intended that it fade with dignity. The faces of devotion and betrayal had passed before her for half a century, each leaving its mark. She had outlasted them all, lovers and traitors, friends and foes. And as the candles burned low around her, she understood that perhaps the true art of rule was not victory or love, but endurance. The queen who had once ruled hearts now ruled memory itself, a woman made of both flame and ash, who had loved fiercely and forgiven rarely, who had trusted few but England most of all, the mirror of the world. By the closing years of the 16th century, Elizabeth's England had become a world unto itself, a kingdom reborn from isolation, humming with trade, invention, and imagination. What had once been a small, fractured island nation now pulsed with confidence, its ships roaming far oceans, its poets reshaping language. its people seeing themselves reflected in the image of their queen. It was not only an age of politics and war, but of vision, a mirror in which the world began to see the English spirit reflected in light and art and word. Elizabeth understood the power of image, as few rulers ever had. She had spent her life constructing one, the Virgin Queen, the wise ruler, the guardian of a golden peace, and that image now radiated through her court into every corner of culture. Artists, playwrights, musicians, and explorers all drew strength from her myth, until the entire kingdom seemed to breathe in rhythm with her. The court itself was the centre of this radiance. It was a world of ceremony and intellect, an organism of movement and display, where the boundaries between government and art disappeared. Painters recorded every tilt of her head. Poets sculpted her virtues into verse. Scholars argued philosophy in her presence while glancing nervously to read her expression. She listened to everything and forgot nothing. Her favour could raise a man from obscurity to fame, and her silence could destroy him. Every talent, every creation had to serve the crown's image. In those great painted halls at Whitehall and Hampton Court, the Renaissance found its English home. The ceilings shimmered with allegory gods, muses, and angels painted as if in service to her reign. Music drifted constantly through the corridors, lute and viol, madrigal and hymn. Foreign visitors wrote of her court as the most brilliant in Europe, a place where politics was conducted in poetry, and power itself had been made beautiful. Yet Elizabeth's encouragement of this flowering was never sentimental. She valued art not only for its beauty, but for its usefulness. The arts became the voice of her policy, the expression of her strength. A painting of the Queen was a message to Europe that she was unchanging, untouchable, eternal. A poem praising her wisdom was also a declaration of national pride. She understood, instinctively, that culture was as effective a weapon as steel. Her portraits multiplied, each more symbolic than the last. Gone were the natural faces of her youth. In their place appeared icons. In one, she stood with hand upon a globe, her fingers resting on the Americas, the suggestion of empire not yet born but already claimed. In another, the rainbow portrait, her gown was covered in eyes and ears, her mantle embroidered with suns, her hand holding a rainbow, bearing the inscription, "Non sign sol iris," no rainbow without the sun. The meaning was unmistakable. There was no peace, no beauty, no order without her light. To her subjects, these images became sacred. They hung in town halls, in merchant houses, in the chambers of scholars. The Queen's face was the nation's seal, her calm gaze the guarantee of continuity. When rebellion stirred, her image was enough to still it. When famine threatened, her proclamations were read like prayers. The writers of her time, too, shaped her myth. Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen transformed her into Gloriana, the eternal embodiment of virtue and sovereignty. Philip Sidney's Arcadia carried her courtly ideals into romance and reflection. The theatre, newly alive in London's bustling districts, echoed her contradictions. Strength and vulnerability, passion and reason, mercy and command. The playwrights who filled those wooden stages, Marlowe, Kyde, and most of all Shakespeare, gave her people a new language to describe themselves. Elizabeth's government, though cautious of unrest, allowed this ferment to flourish. She and her council understood that the arts bound the people more effectively than fear. The Queen herself attended performances when the court companies acted before her, and her laughter or silence could make or end a playwright's career. It was under her watch that Shakespeare's early histories and comedies took shape plays that celebrated England's past and imagined its destiny. The great line, "This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England," spoke to the very vision she had fostered. Beyond her capital, her influence stretched across seas. The same imagination that filled her theatres sent her sailors beyond the horizon. The era of exploration of Drake's circumnavigation, of Raleigh's colonizing dreams, of the first ventures to America, unfolded beneath her gaze. She did not fund these expeditions lavishly, but she permitted and blessed them, knowing that each voyage extended England's reach in mind, if not yet in empire. Francis Drake's return from his journey around the world in 1580 symbolized that expansion of vision. His ship, the Golden Hind, docked at Deptford, glittering with captured Spanish treasure. Elizabeth went to meet him herself. Before the assembled court, she knighted him upon the deck, the sword flashing in the late sun. It was more than ceremony, it was the acknowledgement that her kingdom had stepped onto the global stage. The sailors who once prayed as privateers were now heroes, and England's wooden ships had become its wings. The Queen never allowed the triumphs of others to outshine her own authority. She encouraged adventure but kept a careful distance from its risks. When Raleigh named a colony Virginia, he did so in honour of her chosen image, the Virgin Queen, and she allowed it, seeing in it both tribute and propaganda. But when his fortunes waned, she withdrew her favour without hesitation. Those who served her glory flourished, those who failed her vanished into silence. Within her council, this same pattern held. William Cecil's wisdom guided policy through her middle years, and upon his death, his son Robert continued that legacy. The Cecils understood the Queen's temperament better than any, knowing when to yield and when to stand firm. Their prudence balanced the fire of men like Raleigh and Essex. Together, they preserved the machinery of governance that kept the kingdom stable even through crises. Yet not all stability could soothe Elizabeth's private disquiet. As the years passed, she watched the faces around her change, the poets growing older, the courtiers dying, the laughter of youth replaced by the rustle of ceremony. The same court that had once been vibrant now seemed to her a reflection of herself, brilliant, disciplined, but weary. London, however, thrived as never before. The streets beyond the palace gates buzzed with commerce and craft. Merchants grew rich on cloth and spices. Apprentices crowded the taverns with songs and stories. The city became a world of its own, larger and more alive than the Queen could ever see from her window. In the Globe Theatre, built upon the south bank of the Thames, ordinary men and women watched kings rise and fall, and in their applause could be heard the pulse of a new identity, a people aware of themselves as English in a way they had never been before. Elizabeth had created that identity through endurance. The nation's pride was the echo of her own. Her caution had given them security. Her intellect had given them confidence. Even those who disagreed with her faith or her methods admired her stability. The England of her later years was not free from poverty or fear, but it had found something rarer, belief in itself. This belief extended into philosophy and science as well. Scholars like Francis Bacon began to look at the natural world with a new curiosity, urging reason over superstition. Navigation improved. Cartographers redrew the globe with English lines. Printing presses spread ideas faster than the court could censor them, yet the Crown allowed this controlled freedom to grow. Elizabeth had learned that too much restraint stifled loyalty, and so she gave her people space to dream so long as they dreamed in her name. The Queen's sense of spectacle, refined over decades, reached its height in her later ceremonies. When she appeared before Parliament, she moved like a living symbol, the embodiment of continuity. Her words were precise, deliberate, measured, to inspire without promising too much. In one speech, she declared that though she might lack the power of a man, she possessed the heart of a king. Parliament answered with cheers that shook the chamber. Her addresses were more than politics. They were performance perfected. She spoke not from vanity, but from understanding that the voice of the monarch could bind a nation's will. The people did not love her for what she gave them, but for what she made them believe they were. The mirror she held up to England was not always true, but it was beautiful, and beauty can often preserve peace longer than truth. Even as poverty spread in the countryside and disease swept through cities, the legend of Elizabeth's age endured. The Queen herself cultivated this myth carefully, as if aware that time was already chiselling her likeness into history. Her ability to embody contradictions became the soul of her reign. She was a ruler who avoided wars yet presided over an era of conquest, a woman who remained single yet gave birth to a nation's identity, a cautious mind who inspired poets to dream of boundless worlds. She governed through balance, and balance became greatness. As her hair whitened and her body grew frail, her portraits showed her ageless. In public she stood tall, her face a mask of calm. Her courtiers bowed before that image, half in reverence, half in fear. No one dared speak of succession. The future, like her mortality, was a forbidden subject. Still, she remained at the centre of the world she had shaped. Ambassadors continued to send reports home describing her as formidable and charming, aged in years but not in spirit. The Venetian envoy wrote that she commands men's hearts with a look and rules the realm by intellect alone. Her England, reflected through her, had become something larger than geography. It was an idea. The Elizabethan age, though she could not name it so, had already begun to live beyond her. And so she continued, moving through the golden halls that bore her symbols, surrounded by poets and politicians who owed her everything, walking among the mirrors that reflected her power. Each reflection was slightly different: the stateswoman, the goddess, the scholar, the mother of the nation, yet all were true. Elizabeth had made her reign a mirror of the world, luminous, deceptive, complex, and enduring. The art, the voyages, the words, the nation itself, all carried her face in some form. The painter's brush, the sailor's compass, the playwright's quill, each drew its strength from her, and when foreign princes or ambassadors tried to read her meaning, they found what all had found before them, that Elizabeth Tudor was the reflection of her age, and her age was the reflection of her. Shadows from the north. When Elizabeth entered her middle years of rule, her crown gleamed more brightly than ever before, but its edges had begun to cut. The glory of England's new confidence carried within it a quiet dread that everything she had built could still be broken from within. That threat wore a familiar face: her cousin Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. The story between these two queens had begun long before Mary's arrival in England. Born in 1542, just 9 years after Elizabeth, Mary had inherited her throne as an infant. In France, she was raised to rule and wed a king, surrounded by the splendour of the Valois court. Where Elizabeth's youth was marked by fear and uncertainty, Mary's was gilded in praise. She had beauty, charm, and the open confidence of one who believed herself favoured by heaven. She was everything Elizabeth had been taught not to be: impulsive, romantic, trusting, and she was Catholic. That single difference was destiny. To the Catholic powers of Europe, Mary was the rightful heir to England's throne, legitimate where Elizabeth was not. When Mary returned to Scotland as a young widow, crowned with the glamour of France and the promise of unity, Elizabeth watched closely from across the border. She understood that affection could not soften rivalry, and blood could not cleanse threat. In the beginning, Elizabeth's dealings with her cousin were cautious and polite. She wrote letters full of courtesy, addressing Mary as "my good sister," while warning her against alliances that might endanger the peace between their realms. But beneath those gestures lay mistrust. Mary's claim to the English crown, as granddaughter of Henry VIII's elder sister, gave her legitimacy in the eyes of Rome, and every Catholic noble in England knew it. Mary's reign in Scotland descended quickly into scandal and violence. Her marriage to Henry Darnley, handsome and vain, turned bitter. His murder in 1567, followed by her hasty union with the man accused of the crime, the Earl of Bothwell, shocked even her supporters. Rebellion flared. Forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, James, Mary fled across the border into England, seeking refuge from her cousin. Elizabeth was faced with a dilemma that no monarch could envy. To send Mary back to Scotland was to condemn her to death. To harbour her was to invite danger into her own house. She chose the path she always chose, neither mercy nor cruelty, but delay. Mary was received as a guest, yet placed under guard. What began as temporary protection became captivity that would last 19 years. Mary's presence in England transformed the political landscape. She was both a captive and a banner. Every Catholic rebellion in the following decades unfurled her name as its cause. The Northern Earls rose in her defence in 1569. The Ridolfi and Throckmorton conspiracies wove her name into their letters. To Spain and to Rome, she became a symbol, the martyred queen unjustly imprisoned by a heretic usurper. Elizabeth, however, could not simply kill her. To execute a crowned monarch would be to shatter the sacred order of divine right that protected rulers themselves. If she killed Mary, what was to prevent her own subjects from believing a queen could be judged and slain? The paradox gnawed at her, so she waited. The years passed, and Mary lived as a queen in name, and prisoner in fact, moving between castles and manors under careful watch. She was treated with the outward respect due her rank: fine clothes, servants, correspondence, all monitored. Yet her captivity was gilded only on the surface. The walls were thick, the guards constant, and every letter she sent was intercepted and deciphered by Walsingham's spies. The English spymaster, patient and relentless, built a network across Europe that fed on secrecy and fear. He read what others whispered: every courier, every code, every message hidden in the folds of a gown, all reached his eyes before they reached their destination. Through his agents, Elizabeth learned the pulse of every conspiracy before it was born. Still, Mary was not a woman to surrender quietly. She wrote with elegance and cunning, protesting her innocence, appealing to foreign allies, plotting escape and restoration. To her, Elizabeth was both cousin and captor, sister and enemy. To Elizabeth, Mary was both mirror and warning, a reflection of what might have been had her own caution failed her. For nearly 2 decades, their fates ran in parallel lines that could not converge without destruction. Elizabeth's England thrived, confident and Protestant. Mary's cause smouldered in exile, Catholic and desperate. They never met face to face. Their relationship existed only through parchment and rumour, each imagining the other in forms shaped by fear. By the 1,580 seconds, the pressure had reached breaking point. The Pope's excommunication of Elizabeth had turned rebellion from treason into duty for devout Catholics. Jesuit missionaries slipped into England, disguised as scholars and servants, preaching that salvation required her overthrow. From France and Spain came new plots. From within her own realm, the old families whispered prayers for deliverance. Each conspiracy carried the same refrain: free Mary, crown her, and restore the old faith. The most dangerous came in 1586, the Babington plot. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic noble, corresponded with Mary through letters smuggled inside beer barrels. The messages, written in cipher, spoke of assassinating Elizabeth to place Mary on the throne. Walsingham's agents, as always, had already cracked the code. They let the letters continue until Mary's reply arrived, her approval, signed in her own hand. That single mark of ink sealed her fate. The council demanded execution. Walsingham presented the evidence before the Queen: the letters, the signatures, the web of guilt. Elizabeth read them in silence. When she finally spoke, her words were level. "She has sought my death," she said, "and shall find hers." Yet her hesitation remained. Weeks passed as she pondered the warrant. To execute Mary was to end the question of her own legitimacy forever, but it was also to kill a cousin, a queen, and a woman. Elizabeth's humanity, so often hidden behind statecraft, warred with her duty. Her ministers pressed her, her conscience resisted. In the end, she signed. The warrant went forth. On the morning of the 8th of February 1587, Mary Stuart was led into the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle. Dressed in scarlet, the colour of martyrdom, she walked with steady dignity to the block. She spoke of her faith, her innocence, her trust in God. Her head was severed in a single stroke, and with it fell the last great challenge to Elizabeth's reign. When the news reached London, Elizabeth wept in fury. She claimed the execution had been carried out without her consent, blamed her ministers, and shut herself away. Whether her grief was sincere or strategic, no one could tell, but those who knew her best understood that even victory could wound her. She had removed the shadow that haunted her, but at a cost that stained her soul. Mary's death rippled across Europe. To the Catholic world, she became a saint, to Spain, an excuse. King Philip saw her execution as the final affront that justified invasion. In Rome, priests preached sermons calling for Elizabeth's death, and in England, the people felt both relief and unease, for though their queen had triumphed, something in the air had changed. The shadow from the north was gone, yet it had left behind a deeper one, the knowledge that Elizabeth's reign, however glorious, rested on vigilance and blood. The victory that secured her safety also marked the beginning of the empire's most dangerous hour. In the years that followed, Elizabeth's caution hardened into instinct. The machinery of surveillance that Walsingham built continued even after his death. Every rumour, every ship, every foreign ambassador was watched. The Queen, who had once been merciful, grew wary. surrounded by men and women who owed their lives to her protection and feared her displeasure. England itself was changing. The great nobles of old were giving way to a new kind of subject: merchants, lawyers, adventurers. The Queen's government, once feudal and fragile, had become professional and intricate. Trade routes stretched across oceans, and with them came wealth and ambition that no king or queen could fully control. Still, Elizabeth held the balance. The court, the church, the treasury all moved according to her will. She remained the centre of her nation's identity, the living symbol that united a people still divided in heart. But the cost of that unity was solitude. The throne that once glittered with promise now felt colder with each passing year. When she looked north, she no longer saw rebellion or rivalry. She saw only her cousin's son, James VI of Scotland, now grown, learned, and shrewd. He was Protestant, cautious, and patient, much like herself. The irony was not lost on her. The child of the woman she had destroyed would one day inherit her crown. Perhaps it comforted her to know that her bloodline would continue, even through that irony. Perhaps it haunted her. The North no longer threatened her borders, but it lingered in her thoughts. The rivalry with Mary had defined her middle years. Its resolution defined her legacy. She had outlasted her enemies and secured her realm. Yet every triumph in her life had come paired with loss, and this was no exception. The Queen, who had once faced execution in the Tower, had now ordered another Queen's death. The woman who had been the victim of suspicion had become the instrument of judgment. History, she understood, was a mirror, and in Mary's story she saw her own reversed, distorted, but unmistakably hers. In that realization lay the quiet truth of her reign, that survival, though victorious, is never pure. The shadow that had risen from the north was not only Mary's, it was the shadow of Elizabeth's own humanity, her fear, her pride, her need to endure. She had defeated it, yes, but she would carry its shape within her until the end of her days. The plot and the axe. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, had been the most difficult decision of Elizabeth's life, and though the ink on the death warrant dried decades before her own, it never vanished from her conscience. In that single act she had chosen survival over sentiment, and in doing so she had crossed the final boundary of mercy. The shadow of that choice would follow her into the long dusk of her reign. In the winter after Mary's death, England was quiet, but the quiet was deceptive. The court's laughter echoed against the walls of Whitehall, yet beneath its music ran a low current of fear. Elizabeth's ministers knew that the Catholic powers of Europe would not forgive her. Spain's King Philip, a monarch whose patience rivaled her own, began to prepare the grandest armada ever conceived. The storm was coming. Only its hour was unknown. Elizabeth, though outwardly composed, felt the air change around her. She had lived long enough to recognize the signs of destiny gathering. Her council urged her to strengthen alliances, to prepare the fleets, to summon Parliament for funds. She did all these things without haste or panic. She moved with the deliberate rhythm that had become her signature. The same patience that had once kept her alive in the Tower now guided her empire through peril. The web of intelligence spun by Walsingham stretched across Europe. His agents in Antwerp, Madrid, and Rome sent word of Spanish preparations. They described the vast shipyards, the drilling of soldiers, the priests blessing banners embroidered with the cross. Elizabeth read these reports in silence. "They mean to crush us," she said at last, "and so they shall come to learn how an island fights." Her ministers debated strategy endlessly. Some urged preemptive attack, others counselled negotiation. But Elizabeth knew that England's strength lay not in rashness, but in unity. "If the Lord defend the right," she said, "then the cause is already won." Yet even as she spoke those words, she worked tirelessly behind the scenes, commissioning ships, gathering supplies, and choosing the men who would lead her navy. When the Armada finally sailed in the summer of 1588, the skies above Europe turned dark with prophecy. The fleet stretched across the horizon like a floating fortress, 130 ships, their sails bright with saints, their holds filled with gunpowder, soldiers, and prayer books. They called it the Invincible Armada. In London, fear was tempered by faith. Elizabeth rode among her people, reassuring them with her presence. Her words, calm and steady, carried the authority of a ruler who had faced death before and refused to bow. "We shall meet the enemy," she told her council, "as God has ordained, upon the sea, not upon our knees." The story of Tilbury had already entered legend. When she appeared before her troops, clad in armour, her words rang across generations. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." In that moment, she became more than sovereign. She became the living embodiment of England's defiance. Her speech transformed fear into courage, and courage into victory. The battle itself was as chaotic as it was decisive. English ships, smaller and faster, darted through the waves like hawks, striking at the lumbering Spanish galleons. Fire ships, sent in the night, turned the sea into a burning labyrinth. Storms shattered what the cannons did not. When the Armada fled northward, broken and scattered, the people saw divine intervention in the wind itself. "God blew," wrote one chronicler, "and they were scattered." Elizabeth's triumph was not only military but spiritual. She had stood alone against the might of an empire and endured. Across Europe, even her enemies could not help but marvel. "This woman," one ambassador wrote, "is made of iron." The victory at sea changed England forever. It ended the fear of invasion, solidified Protestant independence, and began the slow rise of a maritime empire. The Queen's image, already mythic, became divine. Paintings of her in armour, radiant and calm, filled the halls of nobles and townhouses alike. Her people saw her not merely as their ruler, but as their protector. Yet in private, the Queen felt no euphoria. She accepted praise with restraint, knowing how fragile triumph could be. The Armada's defeat had drained her treasury, cost countless lives, and left her realm exhausted. She thanked her captains, rewarded her soldiers, and turned her attention once again to healing. "Let not pride," she said to her council, "follow victory as shadow follows light." The years that followed were years of consolidation. Spain remained hostile, but its power waned. Elizabeth's focus shifted to stability, keeping her nobles content, her people loyal, and her enemies cautious. The instruments of her rule, Cecil's policies, Walsingham's spies, the balance between Parliament and Crown continued their careful dance. But power, even well managed, breeds discontent. The more she perfected her art of control, the more her courtiers chafed against it. They were men of ambition, raised in her service yet yearning for their own glory. Among them, none burned brighter or more dangerously than Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He entered her life in the 1,580 seconds, handsome, eloquent, and young enough to be her son. Elizabeth saw in him a spark of the vitality she had lost, and perhaps a reflection of her beloved Dudley. She favoured him, promoted him, and allowed him the intimacy of argument. Essex, intoxicated by her attention, mistook indulgence for equality. He grew bold in council, interrupting her, contradicting her ministers. She tolerated much until he forgot himself. Their relationship became the centre of court gossip. Some called it love, others rivalry, but in truth, it was both. Essex's arrogance tested her patience. His charm softened her anger. He flattered her with words of devotion, called her my queen, my son, and in return, she forgave his recklessness again and again. When war in Ireland threatened rebellion, Essex begged for command. The Queen, against her better judgment, agreed. "Serve me well," she told him, "and you will find me gracious." He promised victory. He returned in failure. Instead of crushing the rebels, he negotiated with them, and then, fearing disgrace, rode back to London without permission. Elizabeth's anger was absolute. "My lord," she said when he appeared unbidden in her chambers, "you have forgotten what obedience means." He was dismissed from office, his titles stripped, his influence gone. The fall of Essex sent shockwaves through the court. The young courtiers who had idolized him grew silent. For months he lingered in disgrace, nursing resentment. His rebellion in 1601 was an act of desperation. Gathering a handful of followers, he marched through London, crying that the Queen's council had betrayed her. The people did not rise. Within hours, he was captured. Elizabeth watched the revolt's collapse with the same calm that had guided her through greater storms. "He sought to rule me," she said, and learned he could not rule himself. When Essex was executed, the Queen's victory felt hollow. He had been more than a subject, he had been the last person to touch her heart. After his death, she grew quieter. The court no longer sparkled as before. The music still played, the masks still danced, but she rarely smiled. The Queen, who had once been surrounded by devotion, now found herself haunted by absence. Walsingham was long dead, Cecil followed him, Dudley gone, Essex gone. The faces that looked back at her were new, polite, and cautious. They loved her as a symbol, not as a woman. Her reign entered its final act. The wars diminished, the empire steadied, but her strength began to fade. She still presided over council meetings, still read state papers by candlelight, still walked the galleries each night. But those who saw her closely noticed the change. Her once bright eyes dulled, her appetite vanished. The burden of years pressed upon her shoulders like armour grown too heavy. In 1601, Parliament met for the last time under her rule. When she appeared before them, the hall fell silent. The woman who had once been feared now inspired only reverence. Her words, though soft, carried the old fire. "There will never queen sit in this seat with more zeal to protect you," she said, "nor a more loving heart." Tears filled the eyes of those who listened. Even her critics bowed their heads. After that speech, she withdrew more and more from public life. The courtiers still waited for her commands, but they came slowly, as if drawn from a well running dry. The affairs of state continued the trade, the diplomacy, the endless tide of letters, yet the pulse of the realm seemed to slow with hers. She aged with dignity, refusing to yield to illness. She would not take to her bed, would not let her people see her weakness. Her ladies attended her in silence as she sat by the fire, staring into the flames for hours. She spoke little. When asked why she would not rest, she replied, "I have seen too many die in their beds." The Tower of London, the old spectre of her youth, stood visible across the Thames from her window. It had haunted her all her life, a symbol of survival and the cost of rule. Sometimes she would look toward it for long minutes, saying nothing. Perhaps she remembered her mother's fall, her own imprisonment, the narrowness of the path that had brought her here. Perhaps she simply saw in its stones the endurance she herself had matched. When death came for her in 1603, it was slow and silent. She refused food, spoke less each day, and at last lay down upon her cushions at Richmond Palace. The courtiers whispered around her. The doctors muttered their futile prayers. She waved them away. She had lived by will alone, and she would die by it. Her body was weak, but her mind remained sharp to the end. When asked who should succeed her, she raised her hand and gestured toward the north, toward the son of the woman she had executed, James of Scotland. The irony did not escape her ministers, nor, perhaps, Elizabeth herself. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, in control to the final breath. When the news spread, London fell into mourning. Bells tolled for days, black banners draped the streets. The people wept openly, for they knew that the age itself had died with her. Elizabeth was carried to Westminster Abbey on a bier draped in white velvet, followed by thousands in silence. As the coffin passed, old soldiers saluted, children knelt, and merchants closed their shops. The woman who had once feared the scaffold now rested among kings. Her death marked not only the end of a reign, but the closing of an era, the last and greatest chapter of the Tudor story. In her wake, she left a kingdom stable, prosperous, and proud, a people who believed in their destiny, and a legend that would never fade. The axe that had once fallen on her enemies had spared her. The plots that had sought to end her had only strengthened her resolve. Her life, written in patience and fire, stood as the measure of endurance. She had lived through danger, through love, through betrayal, through time itself, and though the world she built would change beyond recognition, her spirit, sharp, radiant, and indomitable, would remain woven through the fabric of England forever. The Empire of the Sea. The English Channel that once divided Elizabeth's small island from the mighty powers of Europe became, in her reign, a path to greatness. When she first took the throne, her navy had been a neglected fleet of rotting timbers and unpaid men. By the time her crown had aged with her hair, It had become the spine of a nation that dared to imagine itself as master of the waves. The Empire of the Sea was not born in a single victory, nor in a sudden rush of expansion. It grew from decades of hunger, labour, risk, and vision, fostered by a queen who understood that on the water lay the future of her people. Elizabeth herself had never set foot beyond England's shores, yet she ruled as though she could see over the curve of the world. From her window at Greenwich, she would watch the sails move up and down, the Thames, traders, privateers, and explorers all carrying the same flag. The tide, steady and unending, became the rhythm of her age. The seas were no longer a boundary but a mirror, reflecting England's ambition back at itself. In the early years of her rule, the English navy had been a patchwork of royal ships and private vessels. It was Sir John Hawkins who first began to forge it into a disciplined force, redesigning hulls for speed and endurance, standardizing armaments, and insisting that men be trained, not merely hired. He was both sailor and businessman, bold enough to profit where others saw danger. His cousin, Francis Drake, was even bolder, part warrior, part pirate, and wholly English. To Spain, they were thieves and heretics. To Elizabeth, they were useful instruments of defiance. She did not openly command them to plunder Spanish galleons, but she did not forbid it either. "If they bring us gold," she told her ministers, "we shall ask not too many questions as to how it was gotten." And they brought gold indeed, mountains of it, torn from the treasuries of the New World and delivered into London's vaults. Drake's voyages became the stuff of living legend. In 1577, with the Queen's secret blessing, he set sail on the expedition that would circle the globe. For nearly 3 years he vanished into the unknown, his ships battered by storms, disease, and the hostility of foreign empires. When he returned in 1580 aboard the Golden Hind, his decks heavy with captured treasure, the world had changed. Elizabeth herself came to meet him at Deptford. Before the assembled court, she knighted him upon the deck, the blade flashing in the afternoon light. The message was clear. England's reach had expanded beyond Europe, and its queen approved. The wealth Drake carried home, silver, spices, silks filled her treasury. But his voyage carried something more valuable: the proof that English courage could challenge the powers of the world. After Drake came Raleigh, who dreamed not merely of plunder, but of settlement. He envisioned colonies, plantations, new realms across the sea that would bear the Queen's name. When he called the first of these Virginia, in honour of her virgin state, she smiled and accepted the compliment. The attempt at Roanoke failed, its settlers vanishing into the wilderness, but the idea took root. The English imagination, once bounded by coasts and forests, now stretched across oceans. In London, the docks swelled with ships and noise. The air smelled of pitch and salt. The cries of merchants mingled with the songs of sailors. Maps were redrawn almost monthly, new coastlines etched in ink, each discovery a triumph of endurance. The sea became England's new church, the place where belief in destiny replaced belief in certainty. Elizabeth, for all her caution, understood that these ventures were as much about spirit as about profit. She invested sparingly, but she allowed freedom to those bold enough to risk all. She encouraged the Eastland traders who sought timber from the Baltic and the merchants of the Muscovy Company who opened contact with Russia. Each voyage, each cargo, each chart expanded England's sense of itself. The sailors who served her came to believe they fought not only for wealth, but for a cause. Protestantism and patriotism mingled into a single fervour. The sea, once the domain of Catholic Spain and Portugal, became the battlefield of a new faith, a place where Englishmen could fight, trade, and spread the word of their nation's endurance. At court, the successes of these men were celebrated in masques and music. Poets wrote of oceans as symbols of freedom, of England as a ship guided by the hand of the Virgin Queen. The language of navigation entered every art. "She steers our course," one verse declared, "through tempests unto light." The Queen's image itself began to shift. The portraits of her later years often included maps, compasses, and globes, the instruments of discovery and command. She was painted standing over the world, her gaze directed outward, her hand resting on the globe. In those images lay the unspoken truth. She had transformed a small island kingdom into an empire of imagination. The Spanish, unable to tolerate the humiliation of repeated losses, responded with fury. Their treasure fleets travelled under heavier guard, their colonial governors fortified their ports. Yet for all their might, the tide of history had begun to turn. The English, unburdened by empire's complacency, learned from failure. They built smaller ships, faster and more maneuverable. They trained their sailors not only to fight, but to think. The art of seamanship became a science. Elizabeth herself encouraged these innovations. Though she never pretended to understand the mechanics of navigation, she appreciated its symbolism. She ordered that her captains be treated as gentlemen, their victories recorded, their charts preserved. She granted charters to new trading companies, blending private enterprise with royal authority. The English merchant, once a humble figure, now stood beside the nobleman as an agent of the realm. In this transformation, a new kind of patriotism emerged. The loyalty once owed to the monarch alone began to attach itself to the nation. The sailors who braved the Atlantic carried not just the flag of St. George, but the belief that England itself was chosen. The victories at sea became moral victories, the struggles of common men sanctified by the idea of divine favour. The victory over the Armada in 1588 was the catalyst. Though Spain rebuilt its fleet, it never again commanded fear. The myth of invincibility was broken. England, small yet unbowed, now saw itself as protector of liberty against tyranny. In Elizabeth's speeches, this idea took root and grew. "We are an island," she declared, "but not alone." It was both prophecy and promise. The expansion of maritime trade brought change at home as well. London became the beating heart of the New World economy. The river teemed with ships bearing goods from every corner of the known world: sugar, tobacco, silk, and strange fruits. The Queen's taxes filled her coffers, but she also saw the danger in too much wealth too quickly gained. Inflation crept upward, and the poor still struggled, but the sense of opportunity pervaded all classes. Elizabeth's policies balanced ambition with restraint. She allowed privateers to operate under letters of marque, legitimizing their raids against Spanish shipping, yet she punished those who crossed into outright piracy. She encouraged the founding of companies, but kept them accountable to the crown. She understood that expansion without control could breed chaos. The empire of the sea was thus not merely the work of explorers and admirals, but of governance and vision. Her councillors codified laws to regulate maritime trade, established consulates abroad, and encouraged the study of navigation and astronomy. The great shipyards at Deptford and Woolwich became symbols of national pride. The navy, once improvised, became an institution. Foreign observers recognized the transformation. The French ambassador wrote in 1598 that England hath turned her face from the land to the sea, and in that element she shall find her fortune. The Venetian envoy, impressed by the discipline of her sailors, noted that their queen is not loved for her birth but for her courage, and her people are never idle. Elizabeth's ability to inspire unity among such restless energies was remarkable. She rewarded success, forgave failure when it taught wisdom, and never allowed jealousy to disrupt the greater cause. When two captains quarrelled over spoils, she reminded them, "The sea hath room for all, but no patience for pride." Yet the expansion came with its contradictions. The voyages that brought wealth also brought suffering to foreign peoples, enslaved, to sailors lost in storms, to families who waited years for men who would never return. The Queen heard tales of shipwrecks, of mutiny, of cruelty, and she hardened herself against them. "The sea," she said once, "is no gentle nurse." Her reign was not the age of empire in the full sense that later centuries would know, but it was the foundation of it. She had given her people direction and purpose beyond survival. The Englishman who had once feared invasion now looked outward with confidence. The sailor who had once served for coin now sailed for honour. The Queen who had once ruled by compromise had become the symbol of expansion. In the final decade of her life, Elizabeth watched her captains depart one by one for distant horizons. Raleigh's dreams of El Dorado led him deep into South America. Drake's last voyage ended in fever and death off Panama. She mourned him, not with tears but with silence. "He sought the world," she said, and found eternity. Even as age bent her frame and dimmed her eyes, the sound of the sea still stirred her imagination. The reports of new discoveries reached her desk. Daily maps of strange coasts, sketches of unfamiliar animals, rumours of lands yet unseen. She read them with fascination. The empire she had nurtured was no longer her instrument alone. It had become the destiny of her people. By the end of her reign, England's flag flew in ports from the Arctic to the Indies. The navy she had built stood as the finest in Europe. The merchants of London had grown into princes of commerce. The dreamers who once whispered of distant shores now spoke of dominion. And though Elizabeth herself would not live to see that dream fulfilled, she had already shaped its course. When she died, her coffin was carried through streets lined with sailors. They lowered their heads as it passed, knowing that their own lives had been the measure of her glory. The ships on the Thames fired their guns in mourning, the sound rolling across the water like thunder. It was a fitting tribute to the Queen who had given them their world. The Empire of the Sea began with her courage, her restraint, and her vision. It began with the woman who had never left her island, yet had conquered the world through imagination. In her reign, the horizon ceased to be an ending and became a beginning. The Armada approaches. The year 1588 arrived like the echo of a storm long brewing. Clouds gathered over Europe, not of weather but of will, pride, and divine conviction. King Philip II of Spain had prayed, planned, and built for this moment. The annihilation of Elizabeth's heretical reign, the restoration of Catholic rule, and the submission of England to the papal throne. His fleet, the mighty Armada, was not merely a collection of ships but the embodiment of his faith and vengeance. For nearly 2 years, Philip's shipyards at Lisbon and Cadiz had rung with hammers. Trees were felled across Spain and Italy to feed the furnaces that forged the cannons, to shape the masts that would bear his banners. His priests blessed each vessel with holy water and Latin hymns. Across Europe, his agents whispered that England's doom was written in heaven. The banners painted with saints fluttered in the wind. The ships bore names that invoked divine power: San Martin, San Juan, Nuestra Señora del Rosario. Elizabeth knew of these preparations. Her spies, deft and quiet, carried word from Spain's ports, counting ships, noting crews. Walsingham's network, the finest in Europe, reported every rumour, every delay. Yet though the Queen had warning, she did not panic. She understood that fear was the greatest ally of her enemies. "Let them build," she told her council, "for the sea is wide, and God bloweth where he will." The challenge before her was immense. Spain's empire stretched across oceans. Its armies were veterans of half a century of war. England, by comparison, was small, its navy young, its soldiers untested. But Elizabeth possessed what Philip did: not a people who fought for their own survival, and a leader who ruled through unity rather than decree. Her ministers urged her to seek alliances. She nodded, but relied on something stronger than treaties: the loyalty of her people and the faith that Providence favoured her cause. By the early summer of 1588, the Armada was ready, 130 ships carrying nearly 30,000 men. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, a nobleman of rank but little sea experience, was chosen to lead. His orders were to sail north, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Low Countries, and invade England. The plan assumed calm seas, perfect timing, and divine favour. In May, the Spanish fleet set out, only to be driven back by storms. The men prayed, repaired, and sailed again in July. This time, the wind held. The Armada entered the Channel, its sails filling the horizon, a forest of masts and crosses gliding across the grey waters. In London, the alarm bells tolled. The invasion that had haunted England for decades was at hand. Elizabeth met the news with composure. She convened her council, dispatched messages to her admirals, and ordered the militia to muster along the coasts. She had prepared for this moment with years of vigilance. The navy, rebuilt under Hawkins and Drake, stood ready. Its ships were smaller and faster than Spain's floating fortresses, their crews more agile, their captains veterans of the long privateering wars. The English strategy was clear: strike fast, keep distance, avoid boarding actions where Spain's superior numbers would prevail. Drake, Howard and Hawkins coordinated their squadrons with precision. From Plymouth they watched the approaching enemy, sails bright in the setting sun. "God grant us good winds," Drake said. "There will be more honour than profit here." The first skirmishes began off Cornwall. The English darted in and out of range, loosing volleys from their long guns, then retreating before Spain's slower vessels could respond. The Spaniards fought with discipline but found themselves unable to close the distance. Their formation, the Great Crescent designed to protect their transports, became a trap. For days the running battle continued, stretching along the southern coast. English captains manoeuvred with deadly skill, cutting ships from the edges of the Spanish line, setting them ablaze, forcing them towards shallower waters. At Portland, at the Isle of Wight, at Calais, the Armada bled. The noise of cannon thunder rolled across the channel like a storm that would not end. Meanwhile, on land, England braced. Beacons blazed along the coasts, sending fire from hill to hill. Farmers left their ploughs to take up pikes. Towns sent supplies to the fleet. In London, prayers rose from every church. The city waited not in panic but in grim resolve. The people knew what their queen knew. There would be no surrender. At Tilbury, Elizabeth herself appeared among her assembled troops. She rode slowly along their lines, clad in a white gown and a breastplate of polished steel, her presence transforming anxiety into pride. Her voice, strong and clear, carried across the camp. "My loving people," she began, "we have been persuaded by some that we are careful of our safety, and that we should take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The soldiers cheered, their fear dissolving into devotion. It was not rhetoric but conviction. She had faced death before. She would face it again. Her courage became the nation's armour. At sea, Drake prepared his final gambit. On the night of July 28, he sent 8 fire-ships-old vessels packed with pitch, tar and powder drifting into the anchored Spanish line at Calais. The sight of the flaming hulks sliding through the darkness sent panic through the fleet. The Spanish captains cut their anchors, scattering in chaos. When dawn broke, the English struck. The Battle of Gravelines decided the fate of the Armada. The English guns, firing from a distance the Spaniards could not match, tore through hull and rigging. The wind turned against Philip's fleet, driving them northward toward the open sea. Pursued and harried, they fled into the North Sea, seeking a way home around Scotland and Ireland. Storms finished what English shot had begun. Ships foundered against cliffs, crews perished by the thousands. Only half the fleet returned to Spain, broken and silent. In England, the bells of Thanksgiving rang for a week. The nation that had once feared destruction now celebrated deliverance. Elizabeth attended a service at Street Paul's, walking beneath banners taken from the enemy. Her face was calm, her words modest. "It is not our strength," she said, "but his providence that hath saved us." The Armada's defeat was more than a military victory. It was a transformation of identity. England, once a vulnerable island, had proven itself capable of defying the greatest empire of the age. The sense of destiny that followed would define generations. Elizabeth's image, already sacred, now became eternal. Yet she herself did not indulge in triumph. She rewarded her captains, thanked her soldiers, and returned to the quiet work of rule. She understood that glory could be as dangerous as defeat. Spain remained powerful, and the wars would drag on for years. She focused on rebuilding, on securing trade, on maintaining the fragile peace within her own borders. The courtiers, poets, and chroniclers turned her victory into legend. Paintings showed her standing on maps of Europe, one hand resting on a globe, her gaze turned heavenward. Her courtiers called her Astrea, the goddess of justice returned to earth. The people called her Gloriana, the light of England. In private, she was more subdued. She knew the price of endurance. The sea that had delivered her triumph had also taken thousands of lives. Her admirals wrote of drowned men, of wrecked ships along Ireland's coast, of corpses washed ashore with rosaries in their hands. She ordered prayers for all the dead, friend and foe alike. The victory at sea brought peace for a time, but also new burdens. England's power had awakened jealousy as well as admiration. France watched warily. The Dutch sought advantage. The Scots balanced between alliance and independence. Elizabeth, with her unerring sense for equilibrium, navigated it all with patience. "We are small," she told her council, "but we are as the stone that starteth the wave." The wave had begun, indeed. English merchants and explorers, emboldened by their queen's courage, set out again across the oceans. The dreams of empire took deeper root. The language of conquest softened into the language of destiny. The Virgin Queen had become the mother of a new age. As for Spain, it never fully recovered from its defeat. Philip's power waned, his coffers emptied. The great Catholic crusade against Protestant England ended not with a blaze of glory, but with shipwrecks and silence. Elizabeth had done what no monarch of her line had ever achieved. She had secured her island not by submission, but by the sea. When she looked out from her palace window in the months that followed, the Thames was filled with ships bearing her colours. The sailors who passed beneath her balcony raised their caps and shouted blessings. She acknowledged them with a nod, her face unreadable. In that gesture was the measure of her greatness, not pride, not vanity, but the calm of one who knew she had met the test of her time. The Armada had approached with the promise of England's destruction. It departed, having forged her immortality. The triumph and the aftermath. The victory over the Spanish Armada was not a single day's triumph. It was a turning of history itself. Yet the glory of that moment, so radiant in memory, cast long shadows across the years that followed. The Armada had failed, but the war did not end. Spain still held its empire. France remained a shifting ally, and the quiet struggle between Protestant and Catholic, old and new, never truly ceased. England's queen, who had risen from exile and fear to meet destiny on her own terms, now found herself entering the long twilight of power, ruling an empire that was still forming, a people still testing the limits of freedom, and a court that was beginning to lose its old brilliance. After 1588, Elizabeth became the most celebrated woman in the world. Foreign princes who had once courted her now courted her favour. Poets filled libraries with verses comparing her to goddesses and celestial queens. She was Gloriana, Astrea, the phoenix of her sex, and the bright star of the West. Her courtiers competed for her smiles, her diplomats for her praise, her people for her approval. The world bowed to the image she had crafted, yet beneath the magnificence, she began to feel the weight of solitude. The kingdom she ruled was stronger than it had ever been. The Armada's defeat had given her people unity, pride, and faith in their destiny. The merchant ships returning from the New World carried wealth beyond imagining. London's docks overflowed with spices, silks, and silver. The navy had proven itself the equal of any in Europe. Her government, once fragile, had matured into one of the most efficient in the world. The name of Elizabeth was a spell of power, her very image a national relic. But peace, though precious, was never complete. The war with Spain continued in fragments, raids on coastal ports, battles in Ireland, conspiracies in France and the Netherlands. Elizabeth's admirals urged her to strike again, to carry the fight to the Spanish Main, but she hesitated. "I will not hazard England's fortune on the turn of a wave," she said. She had lived too long to gamble her realm on glory. Her ministers, those patient architects of her reign, began to die one by one. Sir Francis Walsingham, her watchful eye, was gone. William Cecil, the old counsellor who had guided her since the beginning, followed in 1598. His son Robert stepped into his father's place, sharp and clever, but Elizabeth felt the loss keenly. "They were my hands and eyes," she said once, "and now I must see and do alone." Alone, the word grew heavier with each passing year. The court that had once glimmered with music and wit became cautious, subdued. The courtiers who surrounded her now were young men, raised in the safety her generation had earned. They bowed more deeply than the old ones, spoke more carefully, but she sensed in them a kind of pity. Her pride rebelled against it. "They think me old," she told her ladies, "but I am still England." To the people, she remained a near mythic figure. Her annual progresses through the countryside were still celebrated like sacred processions. Villages decked themselves in flowers, and children sang songs as her carriage passed. When she raised her hand in blessing, even the poorest felt themselves touched by Providence. Yet behind that ceremony lay fatigue. Her progresses grew shorter, her public appearances fewer. Her body, long armoured in self-control, began to fail her. Her face, once the envy of poets, now bore the careful artifice of age. The white lead and rouge of her portraits concealed the hollows beneath her eyes, but the people refused to see decay. They preferred the illusion the radiant Virgin Queen, unchanged by time. Elizabeth herself encouraged it, knowing that her image was the mortar holding her realm together. "You must remember me as I was," she once told her painters. The later 1,590 seconds were years of unrest beneath the calm. Harvests failed, prices rose, the poor crowded the cities, the wars in Ireland drained the treasury. Pirates preyed upon merchant ships, even as merchants enriched themselves. The Queen's ministers quarrelled over how to address these troubles, but Elizabeth remained cautious. She had built her reign upon moderation, neither too generous nor too severe, and she would not abandon that principle. "If we must suffer," she said, "then we shall suffer in measure." In 1593, the plague struck London again. The theatres closed, the bells tolled without cease, and death stalked the streets. Elizabeth withdrew to her palaces along the Thames, issuing proclamations from afar, but she refused to flee completely. "I will not hide," she said, "from what all my people face." Her endurance steadied the nation as fear spread. Through it all, the arts flourished. The later years of her reign saw the full flowering of English literature, the sonnets of Spenser and Sidney, the plays of Marlowe and Shakespeare, the histories that celebrated England's past as prophecy for its future. The Queen was both audience and subject. Her presence haunted the stage even when she was not named. Shakespeare's heroines, strong, eloquent, witty, and unyielding, bore her shadow. In Henry V, the King's victory at Agincourt echoed the nation's pride after the Armada. In The Tempest, the spirit of discovery and mastery over nature whispered of the empire she had set in motion. Elizabeth valued these works, not as vanity, but as instruments of unity. "Words," she told her council, "are the children of peace." She understood that culture could bind a kingdom more tightly than law or sword. She encouraged patronage, granted licenses, and turned her tolerance into policy. Though she was careful to suppress sedition, she never stifled imagination. Her reign gave her people permission to think, and they rewarded her with genius. Yet even as her subjects found new voices, her own grew weary. The deaths of her closest friends and servants deepened her isolation. Her beloved Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, had died years earlier. His last letter, found in her chambers after her death, was worn by her touch. The Earl of Essex, her final favourite, had fallen from grace and then from life after his failed rebellion in 1601. His execution left a silence that nothing could fill. "I am tired of being loved by those who turn away," she said afterward. As age closed around her, Elizabeth began to retreat into memory. She still presided over her council, still read dispatches, still signed her letters Elizabeth R., but the flame of ambition had dimmed. She trusted few, spoke little, and often sat for hours by the fire, her hands folded, her mind elsewhere. The courtiers who attended her learned to move quietly, as though in a sacred chamber. Her final years were marked by a kind of solemn dignity. England was secure, her enemies were weakened, her people, though restless, remained loyal. She had accomplished what few rulers ever had. She had turned survival into triumph. But triumph is never free. The solitude that had once been her protection had hardened into her prison. In 1601, Parliament met for the last time under her reign. The members, aware that her health was failing, prepared to present their grievances. Elizabeth, as always, faced them with composure. Her speech that day, remembered as the Golden Speech, was her farewell to power without admitting it. "There will never queen sit in this seat with more zeal to protect you," she said, "nor a more loving heart." Her voice trembled slightly, but her words carried their old strength. Members of Parliament wept openly. When she finished, they knelt as one, not before their ruler, but before their history. After that speech, she withdrew further from the public. She no longer danced, no longer rode out among her people. The palaces that had once echoed with music fell quiet. The courtiers, uncertain how to speak to her, bowed in silence. Even her beloved musicians played softly, as though afraid to disturb her thoughts. In those final winters, she took refuge at Richmond Palace. The days grew shorter, the Thames froze, and the fires burned low. She sat before them, wrapped in layers of velvet and ermine, her face pale against the glow. When ministers came to ask for decisions, she answered briefly or waved them away. "My work," she said once, "is done." It was not resignation but understanding. She had spent 45 years building a nation out of chaos, turning fear into faith. She had faced assassins, armadas, rebellions, and betrayals, and through it all, she had never lost her balance. Now, in the stillness of her final years, she understood that her true triumph was not the crown upon her head, but the continuity of peace. She had been the daughter of a king who broke the world, the sister of a queen who burned it, and the ruler who had mended it. She had proven that a woman could govern without surrendering, could wield power without cruelty, could command loyalty without heirs. Her life had defied the very structure of monarchy, and in doing so, had redefined it. In March 1603, she grew too weak to stand. Her ladies pleaded with her to rest, but she refused to lie down, saying, "If I once lay down, I shall never rise again." For days she remained upright, silent, staring into the shadows as if weighing the sum of her years. Finally, she sank onto her cushions and closed her eyes. When her ministers asked her whom she named as successor, she raised one frail hand and pointed north to James of Scotland, the son of the cousin she had executed. The gesture was both irony and wisdom. She had killed Mary Stuart to save her throne, and now Mary's son would inherit it. Perhaps that was her last lesson that time. Not vengeance is the only true victor. On the 24th of March 1603, at the age of 69, Elizabeth died. The bells of London tolled in mourning, their sound rolling over the river and the fields. The people wept as though an age itself had passed, for indeed it had. The reign that had begun in fear ended in reverence. The Virgin Queen, who had never married yet had given her heart to an entire nation, was carried to Westminster Abbey and laid to rest among kings. Above her tomb, the inscription was simple: "Consorts in throne and grave, here sleep Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope, though not in blood. In death, the two queens who had divided Britain were united at last." Elizabeth's triumph had not been conquest or empire, but endurance. She had ruled through intellect, patience, and faith in her people. She had shown the world that power could be graceful, that strength could be steady, and that a woman's hand could hold a kingdom as firmly as any king's sword. And though time would move on, though other monarchs would rise and fall, the memory of her reign would remain. Her England had learned to dream beyond its shores, to speak with its own voice, to see itself not as a fragment of Europe, but as a world unto itself. That was her legacy, not gold or glory, but identity. The triumph endured, the aftermath became history, and in the centuries that followed, her name would be spoken with reverence, not because she was flawless, but because she had been resolute. The golden twilight. The light that had once burned so fiercely at the heart of England began, in the final decade of Elizabeth's reign, to soften into gold. It was a slow fading, not sudden or tragic, but dignified like the evening sun setting over a calm sea. The nation she had built stood strong, prosperous, and proud. Yet within the palace walls, time moved differently. The years that followed her triumph over Spain were not marked by battles or revolts, but by the steady erosion of vitality that comes to all rulers who outlive their age. The Queen who had once been the future of England now ruled as its memory. The 1,590 seconds were years of both radiance and weariness. The energy that had once defined her court began to ebb, replaced by ritual and remembrance. The nobles and poets who had grown up beneath her gaze had become the elders of a generation, while a younger court, born in the peace she had secured, failed to understand the hardships that had shaped her. To them, Elizabeth was no longer the daring young sovereign of the Armada years. She was an institution, a symbol of authority too vast to question, yet too distant to love. Even so, the realm itself prospered. Trade routes flourished across the world. The navy stood ready, seasoned by decades of experience. London expanded, its population swelling with merchants, craftsmen, and dreamers. The theatres of Bankside drew thousands to see the new plays of Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and their peers. The language of England, once rough and provincial, had become majestic, rhythmic, and immortal. The Queen's name echoed through the works of poets and scholars, through prayers and toasts, through every corner of the known world. But time, though kind to her legend, was cruel to her body. The woman who had once danced at midnight now walked with measured grace, her steps slow, her movements deliberate. Her auburn hair, once her crown of fire, was long gone, replaced by elaborate wigs adorned with pearls and rubies. Her face, painted in white and crimson, became the mask of her own myth. Beneath it, she grew thinner, frailer, though her will remained iron. Those who served her learned to read the difference between her silence and her command. The fiery temper that had once terrified ambassadors now appeared less often, though when it flared, it burned with the same ferocity. "Do not think me softened," she warned her council once. "I have ruled too long to be managed." The passing of her oldest friends weighed heavily. William Cecil, her faithful counsellor from the beginning, was gone. Francis Walsingham, her unseen guardian, had been dead for years. Robert Dudley, the only man who had ever touched her heart, had long since vanished into history. She kept his final letter beside her bed, the paper creased and worn from decades of handling. The newer courtiers Robert Cecil, Raleigh, Essex before his fall tried to fill the void, but she saw in them ambition without gratitude, loyalty without warmth. In 1598, the same year Cecil died, Europe was changing. Spain, though defeated at sea, remained defiant on land. France had been torn apart by religious wars, and now crowned Henry of Navarre, a Protestant-turned-Catholic king. Ireland simmered with rebellion under Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. The wars of faith that had consumed the continent seemed at last to turn their gaze once more upon England. Elizabeth faced these challenges with the same calm she had always shown. She refused to send vast armies abroad, knowing how ruinous such ventures could become. "We are not Rome," she said. "Our strength is not in conquest but in the mind." Yet even her patience could not prevent bloodshed. The Irish wars dragged on, draining men and money. Essex, her final favourite, was sent to crush the rebellion. His failure and his later betrayal would wound her more deeply than she ever admitted. The rebellion in Ireland was not the only unrest of those years. At home, poor harvests brought famine to parts of the countryside. Inflation rose, and the gap between rich and poor widened. The Queen's government passed new laws for the relief of the poor laws that would endure for centuries, but even so, hardship remained. The grandeur of her court stood in sharp contrast to the struggles of her people. Yet the love between Queen and country did not break. The people still cheered her carriage, still whispered prayers for her health, still called her Good Queen Bess. The image of that love, however, became her prison. The cult of Gloriana had elevated her beyond humanity. She could not grow old without betraying the vision she had created. Every public appearance became a performance, every word a ceremony. She smiled through pain, stood when she longed to rest, spoke when silence would have been mercy. A queen must never show decline, she told her ladies, for if she bends, all bends with her. Behind the mask of majesty, loneliness deepened. The nights grew longer. She took to pacing the corridors of Whitehall by candlelight, her footsteps echoing through the vast and silent palace. She often stopped before the great windows that overlooked the Thames. The river glimmered with moonlight, carrying barges downstream toward the open sea. That sight had comforted her since youth, a reminder that the world moved even when she stood still. Sometimes she summoned musicians to play softly in her chamber, not the bright dances of her youth, but slow, plaintive airs that drifted like prayers. The courtiers who attended her noticed that she seldom spoke during these moments, her gaze fixed on the flame of a single candle. To them, she seemed a figure carved from time itself, half woman, half legend. Though she had long ceased to seek flattery, it still surrounded her. Poets continued to write verses comparing her to the sun, the moon, and the stars. Painters still depicted her as ageless, draped in gold and light. The rainbow portrait, painted near the end of her life, showed her as a goddess of eternal youth, her gown embroidered with eyes and ears to symbolize omniscience, her hand holding a rainbow with the words "Non sine sol iris," no rainbow without the sun. To the world, she was still the light that guided the age. To herself, she was already fading. Her faith, though never fanatical, deepened in these years. The rituals of the Church of England brought her comfort. She prayed daily, reading the Psalms aloud in her chamber, her voice steady even when her hands trembled. She saw in her survival not chance but providence. "He hath held me as one chosen," she once wrote, "and I have not let go his hand." Even as her health declined, her mind remained sharp. She read reports, signed decrees, and corrected ministers with the same precision she had shown in youth. The younger courtiers, unaccustomed to such command, often underestimated her. She reminded them, with icy clarity, that her age had not dulled her perception. "I have seen more men undone by haste," she told one, "than I have seen saved by daring." Her foreign policy, though cautious, retained its balance. She maintained peace with France, wariness towards Spain, and watchfulness over Scotland. The thought of her cousin Mary's son, James VI, now King of a united Scotland, lingered in her mind. He had grown into a man of learning and cunning, a Protestant yet tolerant, a monarch who might preserve her legacy rather than destroy it. She began, quietly and without proclamation, to consider him her successor. The Tudor line would end with her, but perhaps its spirit need not. The golden twilight of her reign was illuminated by the very culture she had fostered. The plays performed at the Globe and the Rose reflected her world's complexity, the blend of power and poetry, of tragedy and triumph. In Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, the melancholy of aging mirrored her own. In The Merchant of Venice, the tension between mercy and justice echoed her lifelong balancing act. When she saw Henry V performed, she reportedly smiled at the lines praising England's glory, for they felt like her own epitaph. The Queen's relationship with time had always been one of defiance. She had outlasted every rival, every prophecy, every threat. Yet in the final years, she came to see time not as an enemy, but as an inheritance. The children born under her crown now raised children of their own. The language spoken in her courts was now the voice of a nation. What she had built no longer depended upon her. That realization, both comfort and sorrow, defined her last decade. In 1602, illness began to sap her strength. She still appeared before her council, still walked the halls, but she moved more slowly, and her appetite waned. The courtiers whispered of melancholy, of sleepless nights. She refused to take to her bed. "The sun does not lie down," she said when urged to rest. But she was tired, not only in body, but in spirit. Her death approached without drama, like the quiet end of a long symphony. She spoke little in those final weeks, though she remained alert. When asked if she was content, she replied, "I have seen England safe." When they pressed her about the next king, she raised her hand toward the north. That gesture was enough. On the morning of the 24th of March 1603, she breathed her last at Richmond Palace. Her ladies stood around her, weeping in silence. Outside, the river carried the mist of dawn, and the bells began to toll. She had ruled for 45 years. The news spread across England, with the solemnity of an ending long prepared, for yet still unimaginable. In London, black banners unfurled. In the countryside, church bells rang from dawn until dusk. The people wept not only for their queen, but for the certainty she had embodied. Under her reign, they had learned to see themselves as a people, not merely subjects. When her coffin was carried through the city streets to Westminster Abbey, thousands followed in mourning. Her body was borne upon a bier draped in white velvet, the canopy above it embroidered with gold. The procession stretched for miles. Old soldiers saluted, sailors bowed their heads, women and children knelt as she passed. The air was filled with the slow toll of bells, the beating of drums, and the quiet murmur of prayers. At Westminster, she was laid to rest beside her sister Mary. The Latin inscription carved upon her tomb read, Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection. The irony of that pairing, the Protestant and the Catholic, the executioner and the executed's kin, seemed almost divine, as though history itself sought reconciliation. In death, Elizabeth's legend only grew. The poets who had sung of her while she lived now wrote elegies that transformed her into myth. She is not dead, one wrote, but changed into the glory she deserved. To later generations, she became the embodiment of England's awakening, the mind that steadied the realm, the heart that defied despair, the flame that refused to die. The golden twilight of her reign marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. The Tudor line was finished, but the age she had shaped endured. The language, the navy, the laws, the self-belief of a nation all carried her imprint. The empire that would one day rule the seas had been born in her shadow. She had begun as the child of disgrace and ended as the mother of her people. Her rule had been both fragile and eternal, cautious and magnificent. In the quiet of that final evening, as the crown passed north to James Stuart, England stood not diminished but transformed. The setting sun of Gloriana became the dawn of a new world, the last of the Tudors. The death of Queen Elizabeth I was not merely the passing of a sovereign, it was the extinction of a dynasty. The Tudor sun, which had risen in fire with Henry VII's victory at Bosworth and blazed across a century of triumphs and terrors, sank at last into silence. In her, the great line ended. She left no heir of her body, no son or daughter to carry her name. Yet in the emptiness she left behind, there glowed the afterlight of something larger than blood, a vision of a people bound not by lineage, but by destiny. For Elizabeth herself, the end came not as a sudden stroke, but as the slow unravelling of strength. In those last days at Richmond, the palace that had once rung with the sounds of laughter and lutes grew hushed. The courtiers who had spent a lifetime fearing her anger now moved softly through the corridors, as though afraid to wake history itself. Her great canopy of estate still stood over her chair, the embroidered arms of England gleaming faintly in the candlelight, but the figure who had ruled beneath it was diminished to a frail shadow. She had ruled longer than any English monarch before her 45 years of storms and splendour. Time itself seemed reluctant to claim her, yet the signs of departure had been visible for months. Her appetite was gone, her sleep grew shallow, her silences lengthened. She would sit for hours, motionless, her fingers tracing the beads of a rosary, though she no longer followed Rome's faith. Her ladies wept quietly, fearing to speak. The courtiers waited for news that none wished to hear. Even as her body failed, her mind remained lucid. Visitors found her gaze sharp as ever, her words few but measured. "I am tied," she said once to Robert Cecil, "to the wheel of time. I must turn and turn and turn again until I am broken." When her physicians urged her to rest, she refused. "A queen should die standing," she told them, "not lying like a milkmaid." And so she sat upright, day after day, as if sheer will could keep death at bay. The great drama of succession, so long avoided, so long feared, now loomed. She had never named an heir, never allowed her council to speak openly of what would come after her. To do so, she had always said, was to hasten her own end. But time had forced her hand. There was no Tudor left save herself. The choice lay between uncertainty and peace. In the north, James VI of Scotland waited. The son of the woman Elizabeth had executed, he was both her greatest irony and her most sensible heir. He was Protestant, intelligent, and politically shrewd. For years, their ministers had exchanged careful letters, testing each other's goodwill. Elizabeth knew that to secure England's peace, she must forgive the shadow of the past. When Cecil asked her, in that dim final week, to name her successor, she lifted one trembling hand and gestured northward. That was all. It was enough. On the morning of the 24th of March 1603, as dawn broke over the Thames, Elizabeth breathed her last. Those present said her lips moved as if in prayer, though the words were too faint to hear. Some claimed she whispered Dudley's name. Others swore she murmured only England. Whatever the truth, she died as she had lived alone, resolute, unyielding. The silence that followed was immense. The moment her heart ceased, the machinery of continuity began to turn. Messengers galloped north with sealed letters announcing James's accession. Bells tolled across London, churches filled with weeping citizens. The people, who had known no other ruler, mourned as if for a mother. "She was not only our queen," one chronicler wrote, "but the spirit that kept us alive." Her body was borne from Richmond to Whitehall, and from there to Westminster Abbey. The funeral procession was a vision of solemn magnificence. The hearse was draped in white velvet, the canopy above it hung with her arms and motto, "Semper Idem, always the same." Around her coffin stood banners bearing the symbols of her lineage, the red dragon of Wales, the white greyhound of York, the lion of England. Trumpets sounded, muffled drums beat, and the people followed in silence. When the procession entered London, tens of thousands lined the streets. Old men who had seen her coronation knelt beside children who had known no other monarch. The Thames, her lifelong companion, shimmered with reflected banners. Sailors stood on the decks of their ships, firing salutes that echoed through the city. "Look how she sleepeth," murmured one spectator, "and yet she ruleth still." Is Pleisty. Inside Westminster Abbey, she was laid to rest in the south aisle of the Lady Chapel, in the tomb that had once held her sister Mary. The Latin inscription carved upon the stone read, "Consorts in throne and grave, here sleep Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection." It was an epitaph both just and ironic, the Catholic and the Protestant, divided in life, reconciled in eternity. Her death marked the end of the Tudor age, but not of the world she had shaped. The crown passed smoothly to James Stuart, and for the first time, England and Scotland were joined under a single monarch. The fears of civil war, of foreign invasion, of chaos and succession crisis all dissolved like mist. It was Elizabeth's final victory. She had given her people stability beyond herself. In the months that followed, London transformed its mourning into remembrance. Portraits of the late Queen multiplied. Ballads were sung in the streets. Plays and sermons celebrated her reign as an age of light. Poets called her the Phoenix Queen, whose death would give birth to new greatness. Her image, once a symbol of living power, became a relic of memory, a golden face gazing eternally from canvas and coin. James, though eager to assert his own rule, knew that he walked in her shadow. He ordered her tomb adorned with marble effigies, her crown and sceptre sculpted above her likeness. When foreign ambassadors came to his court, he spoke of her with reverence. She was, he said, a prince who ruled like a man and lived like an angel. Yet even as her memory was honoured, her humanity faded. The legend of Gloriana eclipsed the woman behind it. The Elizabeth remembered by her people was not the cautious, calculating monarch who read every letter twice before answering. She was the radiant spirit who defied kings and storms. The child who had trembled in the Tower, the woman who had wept for Essex, the aging queen who feared her own reflection, all were swallowed by myth. But history, patient and honest, has restored her complexity. She was proud and insecure, merciful and ruthless, vain and visionary. She lied when she needed to, forgave when it suited her, and ruled with a blend of grace and cunning unmatched by any ruler before or after. She was neither saint nor tyrant, but something rarer, a human being who mastered her age without being mastered by it. The last of the Tudors had inherited chaos and left order. She had turned faith into policy, survival into strength, isolation into empire. Under her, England discovered not only its courage but its identity. The Renaissance blossomed in her shadow. The seeds of empire took root in her soil. The English language itself, refined and glorified by her poets, became her monument. The golden twilight of her reign gave way to the dawn of the Jacobean era, yet the echo of her presence lingered in every chamber of power. Her successors would invoke her name in moments of crisis. Her image would hang in every hall of government. Even centuries later, when other queens would rise to the throne, they would measure themselves against her. The world she left was not perfect, but it was enduring. The tensions between faiths, the inequalities of wealth, the struggles of the poor, all remained. Yet the people had something they had never known before: faith in themselves. That was her true legacy. Her life had begun under the shadow of the axe. It ended beneath the canopy of triumph. She had been the daughter of a condemned woman, the sister of a tyrant, the prisoner of suspicion, the queen of an island that no one believed could stand against empires. And yet she endured. She made endurance itself into art, and patience into power. As the chroniclers of her reign would later write, she found England of wood and left it of marble. She had done so not by conquest, but by imagination. Her gift to her people was not wealth, but identity, not a throne to fear, but a crown to admire. And so the last of the Tudors rests still, her effigy serene, her hands folded in peace. Above her, the vaulted stone catches the faint light that filters through the abbey's windows, as if her spirit still glows there. Visitors paused before her tomb and read the words carved into marble, feeling perhaps what her subjects once felt, the strange comfort of a ruler who seemed both mortal and eternal. 4.5 centuries later, her reign remains one of the great turning points of human history. The Reformation's chaos, the Renaissance's promise, the birth of modern government, the awakening of a nation, all these currents met in her. To speak of England is to speak of Elizabeth. To speak of Elizabeth is to speak of endurance itself. The last of the Tudors was not the end of a dynasty, but the beginning of an idea that power, tempered by intellect and grace, could shape not only a nation, but an age. The final curtain. The reign of Elizabeth I had begun in the shadow of peril and ended in the light of legend. When she breathed her last at Richmond Palace in March of 1603, an age died with her. Yet death, as it often does with the great, failed to silence her. It merely transformed her from woman to myth, from monarch to memory. The final curtain of her story was not drawn with her last breath, but with the centuries that followed, in which her name became a living symbol of endurance, identity, and the strange alchemy between power and solitude. In those early days after her passing, the grief that filled England was profound but orderly. There was no rebellion, no uncertainty, no scramble for the crown. The nation she had crafted, so long accustomed to the equilibrium of her rule, accepted the new king without resistance. Her greatest fear, that chaos would follow her death, never came to pass. The peace she had guarded for 45 years endured. It was her final victory, achieved not through sword or decree, but through trust. At Westminster, where her body lay in state beneath a canopy of gold, thousands came to pay homage. They filed past her bier in silence, each carrying a candle, each face touched by the same awe that had shaped their lives under her gaze. The light of those candles flickered across her coffin like the reflection of dawn on water, soft and trembling. To those who knelt there, she was not gone, she was England itself, resting. The funeral procession that carried her to the Abbey was unlike any seen before. The streets of London were hushed but crowded. Bells tolled from every steeple. The River Thames, lined with ships draped in black, echoed with the sound of muffled cannon fire. Her coffin, borne upon a car drawn by 4 horses draped in black velvet, moved slowly through the city she had loved and guarded. A solitary banner led the way, her emblem, the Tudor rose, entwined with a phoenix rising from flame. Behind it marched the heralds, nobles, and soldiers who had served her. Then came the ladies of her household, their veils soaked with tears. Among them, the Countess of Nottingham carried the sword of state, and beside her, the Earl of Pembroke bore the sceptre. The crown rested upon a purple cushion, its jewels catching the grey light of the morning. When the procession reached the Abbey, a hush fell over the crowd so deep that one could hear the rustle of silk and the whisper of prayers. The coffin was lowered into the vault beside her sister Mary. As the Latin words of the burial service echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling, the courtiers who had once feared her wrath now wept openly. The organ swelled, the choir sang, and for a moment the vast space seemed to tremble with the sound of gratitude. Consorts in throne and grave, the inscription would later read, "Here sleep Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection." The irony was tender, almost deliberate, the Catholic and the Protestant, reconciled in stone. Outside, the people lingered for hours, unwilling to leave. The air was heavy with the scent of candle wax and rain. A child's voice was heard calling, "God save the Queen," and others joined, not as protest but as prayer. The new king, James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, entered the capital to little fanfare. His coronation was peaceful, his succession undisputed. Yet he understood, perhaps better than anyone, that he was inheriting not merely a kingdom but a legend. "I follow," he said, "a prince who was greater in spirit than in lineage." For years afterward, Elizabeth's presence haunted her successors. Her portrait hung in the royal chambers, her likeness engraved on coins, her name invoked in speeches and sermons. The poets who had sung her praises in life continued to exalt her in death. Spenser's verses called her the Gloriana, Queen of Grace and Might. Shakespeare's histories, written in the twilight of her reign, still glowed with the spirit she had kindled. Her legacy was not a monument of marble but of mind. She had left her people the habits of order, the taste for learning, and the confidence of identity. She had guided her realm from the turbulence of the Reformation into the calm of nationhood. The England that rose after her was no longer a fractured, fearful island, but a power with vision and will. The age that followed the Jacobean would explore lands she had only dreamed of, build ships on the foundations she had laid, and speak a language enriched by the poets she had nurtured. The very cadence of her England would echo for centuries in every part of the world. To understand her final years is to see how the burden of time shaped her into the figure she became. The girl who once trembled before her father's wrath had learned to wield command with silence. The prisoner who had once feared the Tower had built her reign on caution and foresight. The queen who had once wept for love had turned solitude into statecraft. Her mastery lay not in conquest but in composure. She had ruled through words, through pauses, through gestures. She had made her stillness into a fortress. Even her vanity, the jewels, the paint, the elaborate rituals was not mere pride, but strategy. She understood the power of image in a world that doubted a woman's authority. To appear eternal was to command obedience, and so she became eternal. Every generation since has rediscovered her in a new form. To the Victorians, she was the guardian of empire. To the Romantics, the embodiment of courage. To modern historians, the architect of identity. Yet all these visions share one truth, that she was greater than her time. In the fading light of her reign, she had often been asked how she wished to be remembered. As a good ruler, she said, and if God please, as a woman who meant well. That humility, almost startling in its simplicity, revealed the core of her greatness. Beneath the splendour of Gloriana, beneath the myth of the Virgin Queen, there remained a heart that had known fear, love, loss, and the relentless loneliness of command. The final curtain of her life, then, was not tragedy but transcendence. Her death did not diminish her, it completed her. In dying without heirs, she ensured that her realm would remember her, not as mother or widow, but as something rarer, as the spirit of its beginning. Centuries later, visitors to Westminster still pause before her tomb. The light that filters through the abbey's stained glass falls softly upon her marble effigy, the face serene, the hands folded in prayer. Tourists whisper, historians linger, poets leave flowers. The air around her grave feels almost suspended, as if time itself slows out of respect. If one listens closely, perhaps one can still hear the faint echo of her own voice, the voice that once steadied a trembling nation, that spoke to soldiers at Tilbury, that comforted her people in plague and famine. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she had said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Those words endure because they hold the essence of her truth. She was the queen who ruled not by inheritance but by intellect, not by force but by faith. She transformed frailty into power, circumstance into destiny, and when her final curtain fell, the applause of history did not cease. In the centuries since her passing, England has changed beyond recognition. Empires have risen and fallen, wars have come and gone. The world she knew has been rewritten, yet her name remains. Statues still bear her likeness, her portraits still adorn museums, her story is still told in classrooms and whispered in dreams. For in her, the nation found its voice steady, unyielding, and luminous. The curtain closed, but the light did not fade.